June 1st, 1981. The Chicago sky is dark and gloomy. Neon motel signs flicker in the darkness. Rain pounds against the concrete as 3 detectives from DuPage County trudge across a field behind the Brer Rabbit Motel in Villa Park, their coats slick with water. The motel sits between a row of rundown bars and shuttered shops, a place locals know by many names. But whatever you called it, it was a magnet for trouble. Quick encounters, drug deals, people that came and went as discreetly as possible. Earlier that day, a maid had reported a foul smell coming from the back lot that had been getting worse for days. When her manager had gone to investigate, he'd stumbled across the heavily decomposed remains of a woman. Now slogging through mud and trash, the detectives expect to find a vagrant or another overdose case, nothing that'll make tomorrow's paper. As they move closer to the remains, the smell hits them first, sweet, sour, and unmistakable. A smell of death so strong that even the heavy rain can't disguise it. But what they find doesn't even look human at first. It's the body of a woman, just as the manager had reported. But it would be more accurate to describe it as what's left of one. The woman is lying face up. What little skin remains is waxy and peeled away by insects and time. The rest of her is practically skeletal. Her wrists are still locked in metal handcuffs. A cloth gag is wedged between her teeth. A sweater clings to her upper body, and her underwear is pulled down to her thighs. Even through the rot and decay, something small stands out to the detectives. Inside her socks, they find a few folded dollar bills, untouched. Whatever happened to her, it wasn't robbery. They note something else that's strange too. No one had seemingly noticed the body or the smell until the maid. Yet if she'd been lying here for weeks, as it seems, the smell wouldn't have just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. That meant one of two things. Either the body and its horrific smell had somehow gone unnoticed for weeks, or somebody had brought it here recently, already in a state of severe decay. But the idea of anyone hauling a decomposing corpse across town is almost too grotesque for the detectives to imagine. So the body is transported to Deputy Coroner Pete Siekman, who faces the near impossible task of finding out who she was and what had happened to her. Given her skin is too degraded for fingerprints and her face is all but gone, identification initially seems hopeless. The detectives comb through missing person reports, cross-checking every small detail they have: hair, height, clothing, but nothing matches. Then a call comes in from the Chicago PD, telling them that the money found tucked into her socks is a trick often used by sex workers to hide their earnings. And while this gives them a lead, it isn't a promising one. If anything, it leads them to believe she might be even more difficult to identify. As he begins his autopsy, Siekman confirms what they already know. This woman didn't die of natural causes. But then comes the shocking and gruesome twist nobody sees coming. Despite the advanced decomposition of her body, he determines that she's only been dead for 3 days, which sounds impossible to the detectives, who wonder how the hell that could be true, given the skeletal state of her remains. But the reason for the rapid decay soon becomes clear. Her chest has been cut open, with both of her breasts having been removed with either a knife or a fine wire. And these open wounds had exposed her chest cavity, accelerating the decay until her body seemed weeks old, instead of just days. Even more disturbingly, it appears that one of the breasts had been removed while she was still alive. From what's left of her jaw, Siekman is able to take dental impressions, and to everyone's surprise, 2 weeks later, he has a name. The body belongs to Linda Sutton, a 26-year-old sex worker and mother of 2. She'd last been seen on May 23rd. It appeared that Linda had been held somewhere for around a week, being tortured and abused the entire time. She'd been beaten, assaulted, stabbed, and finally mutilated before death. The detectives knew one thing for certain. This wasn't random violence. It was controlled, deliberate, the work of someone who found purpose in cruelty. But what no one realized then was that this discovery behind a forgotten motel would mark the beginning of one of the most depraved murder sprees in American history. A spree carried out not by one man, but 4. Men who called themselves brothers, men bound by a twisted ritual and convinced they were serving something darker than God. A satanic cult, following a leader they claimed had a supernatural power to make anyone do his bidding, who took part in some of the most disturbing rituals you'll ever come across. This is the story of America's worst cult killers. or as the press came to call them, the Ripper Crew. By the early 1980s, Chicago was a city of contradictions. Glass towers rising above crumbling neighborhoods, streetlights flickering over boarded-up houses and abandoned factories. For women working those corners, danger wasn't a matter of if, but when. Police rarely investigated missing sex workers unless a body turned up, and even then, the attention was fleeting. That was the world Linda Sutton lived in. She was 26 and a young mother of two, with a quick laugh and a soft voice that made her seem younger than she was. Her friends said she was easy to talk to, the kind of person who could calm a stranger in seconds. But Linda had fallen into the same cycle that caught so many women in that part of the city. Rent was due, jobs were scarce, the streets offered money, and it seemed like the only way to keep food on the table for her children. She told her mother she'd get out soon, but then she disappeared. When Linda vanished in late May of 1981, it barely made a ripple. She'd missed a few calls home before. Her mother assumed she was staying with friends, maybe working the motels along North Avenue, and as far as the police were concerned, a missing prostitute was hardly news. A week later, they found her body behind the Brer Rabbit Motel. The official cause of death was multiple stab wounds to the chest, but the mutilations dominated every conversation in the DuPage County morgue. Yet with no witnesses, no forensic evidence, and no leads, the case went cold almost immediately. The file on Linda Sutton was boxed, labelled, and pushed into storage. The press ran a few short paragraphs calling her an unidentified female, and the city turned the page. But somewhere in Chicago, a group of men knew what had happened, and for them, this was only the beginning. On the 12th of February 1982, police in the western suburbs received a call about a stalled car on the shoulder of Route 83. Inside, they found a purse, a set of keys, and a coat folded neatly on the passenger seat. The gas tank was empty, and the owner, a 35-year-old cocktail waitress, was nowhere to be found. Last anyone knew, she'd been driving home from work. But even if she'd run out of gas, would she really have just left all her belongings in the car like that and walked off? Officers searched the roadside, calling her name out into the cold air. And then a few hundred feet down an embankment, a flashlight beam hit something pale in the snow. Her body was found lying face up, twisted awkwardly. She'd been beaten, sexually assaulted, and mutilated, her right breast cut cleanly away. The similarities to Linda Sutton's case were unmistakable, though nobody made the connection at the time. Within days, another body surfaced. A young Hispanic woman, who was never conclusively identified, was found strangled near the river. Her killer had bitten her repeatedly, leaving teeth marks all across her chest. Her engagement ring still clung to her finger, once again ruling out robbery as the motive. But as in the first two cases, there was no suspect, no vehicle, and no evidence pointing them anywhere. By that point, the three murders sat in different folders on different desks. Two of them were being handled by different divisions of the DuPage County Sheriff's Office, while the third, the woman found by the river, had fallen under Chicago PD and the Cook County Medical Examiner's jurisdiction. Separate agencies, separate evidence rooms, separate detectives who didn't know what the others were working on. Even the autopsies hadn't been done by the same people. One fell to a DuPage County coroner's team, the other to Cook County pathologists. And anyway, coroners don't build patterns, they certify causes of death. Unless someone specifically asked for comparisons, those reports would never cross the same desk. So even though the DuPage victims shared unmistakable hallmarks, young women, sexual assault, and the precise mutilation of their breasts, no one connected them. And the third body, sitting in a different county altogether, was treated as something else entirely. Then on May 15, 1982, Lorraine Borowski left her apartment in Elmhurst just after 8 a.m. She locked her door and walked the short distance to her office at Remax Realty on St. Charles Road. She was wearing khaki slacks, a white ruffled blouse, and a beige purse with wooden handles. By 8:30, her boss, Donald, arrived to find the door still locked, and scattered across the sidewalk were a set of keys, a few cosmetics, and a pair of women's shoes. He gathered them up, assuming they'd been dropped by someone on the street, until he noticed one of the keys was marked Remax, and when he tried it in the door, it fit perfectly. They were Lorraine's belongings, but her purse was nowhere to be seen, and neither was she. Police searched the surrounding blocks, questioned her neighbours, and distributed flyers. The only potential lead they found was from a nearby store owner, who told them he'd seen a red van parked nearby just before the abduction appears to have occurred, though at the time there were no items in front of the Remax store. But it wasn't much to go on, and soon, weeks turned into months. There were no other witnesses, no ransom calls, no sign of her at all. She'd just vanished. 4 months later, in October, the badly decomposed body of a woman was discovered in a patch of overgrowth in Clarendon Hills Cemetery. Torn clothing and a purse was found nearby, perfectly matching what Lorraine had been wearing when she disappeared. And dental records soon confirmed that it was indeed Lorraine's body. The brutality of the crime was staggering. Ligature marks were found on her wrists, alongside puncture wounds from something like an ice pick. Her face was fractured and had bruising consistent with prolonged beating, and her right breast had been removed with steel wire, with a hatchet being used to finally kill her. And then 2 weeks after Lorraine disappeared, another woman vanished, this time from the far northwest suburbs of Chicago. Her name was Shui Mak, and she was a waitress who'd come to the United States from Hong Kong 3 years earlier with her parents and siblings. The Maks had opened a small family restaurant called Ling Ling's in Streamwood, a quiet stretch of suburbia that seemed safely removed from the violence in the city. Shui was hardworking, shy, and careful. She worked long hours and spent most nights helping her parents close up the restaurant before heading home with her brother, Kent. On the evening of May 29, 1982, she left work tired, but in good spirits. But in the car with her brother, they began arguing, the sort of nothing argument siblings forget about in no time at all. But this one would have terrible consequences. Because somewhere along Barrington Road, her brother pulled over and told her to wait by the roadside. Their parents were driving not far behind them, and in anger, he told her she could ride home with them instead. Shui stepped out of the car in her red sweater, black pants, and sandals, and stood under the yellow glow of a streetlight as her brother drove off. Minutes later, the family's other car passed her by, having failed to spot her. By the time they'd realised she was waiting for them and turned around to go back to pick her up, she was gone. The Maks searched every corner of the highway that night, convinced she couldn't have gone far, but with no luck they called the police for help. But days passed, then weeks, and there was no trace of her. For months, the Maks searched every ditch and wooded area along that highway. Then, in late September, a call came in. A body had been found in a field just east of Barrington Road, less than a mile from where Shui had last been seen. When police arrived, the smell of decay clung to the air. The body was partially buried and weeds had started growing over it. But Shui's red sweater was still visible beneath the dirt. Identification was made through her clothing. Her autopsy revealed a fractured skull and a wound across her chest. As you can probably guess by now, her breast had been removed with wire or a fine blade. From Villa Park to Elmhurst to Barrington, women were being abducted, tortured, and mutilated, all within a 50-mile radius, and all the cases carried the same hallmarks. But then in June, something changed. For the first time, a victim survived, and her account would finally give investigators a sense of the sort of unimaginable evil they were actually dealing with. Angel York was a 20-year-old sex worker on the north side of Chicago. Like many of the women before her, she knew the dangers of her work, but she needed money. The rent was due, and her boyfriend had been out of work for weeks. On the night of June 13, 1982, a red van pulled up beside her. The driver offered her more money than usual for a short job. Although Angel hesitated, sensing something was off, she needed the bills he flashed at her, so she climbed into the van. The moment the door slid shut, a hand clamped over her mouth. Another grabbed her wrists. The men in the van cuffed her hands to the metal frame, stripped her, and pressed a knife against her skin. One of them then ordered her to cut her own breast. When she refused, they beat her until she obeyed them. After she'd done what they demanded, one of them cut her further before ejaculating onto her wound, laughing the entire time. and when he was done, he taped over her cuts with duct tape and threw her naked into an alley. But somehow she managed to crawl to a nearby payphone, leaving a trail of blood behind her, and dialed for help before collapsing. At the hospital, detectives questioned her while surgeons worked to save what remained of her breast. Angel described what she could remember of the attack: a red van with the back lined in rough wooden panels. She said there were multiple men inside, including a driver who seemed oddly calm, as if what was happening was just something mundane and routine. It wasn't much, but it was more than any of the investigators had ever had before. A vehicle to watch for, and the possibility that more than one man was involved. Detectives compared her account to their unsolved files, wondering if the same red van could be behind the other mutilation cases scattered across the city. Then in August, Sandra Delaware was found along the banks of the Chicago River. She'd been beaten, strangled, and mutilated. Her wrists were bound, a rock had been forced into her mouth to stifle her screams, and her breast had been removed. Her autopsy showed she had been killed only hours before her body was discovered. Less than a month later, on September 8th, 30-year-old marketing executive Rosebeck Davis was found in an alley beneath the stairwell of a 3-story North Lakeshore apartment building in the Gold Coast neighborhood. She had suffered dozens of stab wounds. Her face had been so badly beaten with a hatchet that she was almost unrecognizable. Her trousers were torn, her blouse ripped open, and like all the others, her breast had been removed. Desperate for answers, investigators reached out to the FBI's fledgling behavioral science unit at Quantico. The analysts there, among them Robert Ressler, one of the early pioneers of criminal profiling who we've discussed countless times here on the channel, reviewed what little evidence they were sent and returned a short report. They concluded that the killer was likely a single white male in his late 20s or 30s, who was effeminate, sexually conflicted, impotent, and driven by resentment towards women. It wasn't a bad guess, given the fragments they had. But it was wrong. If anything, the FBI's conclusion that one man was responsible only made things worse. It pushed investigators even further from the truth, that the mutilations weren't the work of a lone sadist, but an entire crew. Around the same time, Carol Pappas, the wife of Chicago Cubs pitcher Mitt Pappas, also vanished after leaving her home in Wheaton. However, her body would not be found until 5 years later, when her car was discovered submerged in a nearby pond, with her body still inside. Because of the advanced decomposition, investigators were never able to determine a clear cause of death, and to this day, it remains unclear whether she was another victim or if she died in a terrible accident. And then on October 6th, another victim was found beside the railroad tracks in Chicago's Humboldt Park by a sanitation worker. Her name was Beverly Washington, a 20-something sex worker, known on the streets for her sharp sense of humor and her bright clothes. Her left breast had been amputated, and her right one had been severely slashed. She'd been stabbed multiple times in her torso before being dumped like garbage. But amazingly, she was still alive. And as a result, she was able to tell her story. From her hospital bed, weak but still lucid, Beverly said that a red Dodge van with tinted windows pulled up beside her. The man behind the wheel, who she said was slender, in his mid-20s, and had greasy brown hair and a thin moustache, then offered her an unusually high price for what she called a date. But when she got into his van, a man pulled a gun on her and forced her to undress. Then he handcuffed her and made her swallow a handful of pills mixed with soda. As she began to lose consciousness, she saw him holding a cord over her. But then everything went black. She recalled that her attacker was wearing square-toed boots and a flannel shirt. And she described the van as having a makeshift wooden divider separating the front and back of the interior, with everything covered in some sort of cheap carpet. And hanging from the rearview mirror, she said there was a feather attached to a roach clip. The details were almost identical to what Angel York had described just months earlier. The same red van, the same wood-panelled interior. But her statement was much more detailed, and unlike Angel's, included specific descriptions of the suspects. Later that day, 2 men were standing near a phone booth when a red van pulled up alongside them. Without warning, shots rang out from inside. Both men were hit, with one of them dying from his wounds. His name was Rafael Tirado, a small-time dealer known around the neighborhood. At first, detectives treated it as a drug dispute gone wrong. But the details didn't fit. The van matched the descriptions from the other assaults, and witnesses said the gunman seemed organized, deliberate, not panicked. But police had no reason to connect this random shooting to the other attacks. Not yet, at least. In the meantime, Detective Warren Wilcosh began canvassing the streets with flyers describing the van, warning sex workers and truck drivers to keep an eye out for it. He spent nights walking the avenues where Beverly and Angel had worked, asking questions and following rumors. And then one day, local officers spotted a van that seemed to be a match. And in that moment, everything finally began to unravel. And whatever the detectives were thinking so far, the truth of what was going on was so much more disturbing and messed up than anyone could have ever imagined. A couple of weeks after the attack, a van matching Beverly's description was finally spotted. When Chicago detectives approached the vehicle, the driver, a stocky red-haired man, rolled down his window, calm but wary. His name was Edward Spreitzer. Edward didn't match Beverly's description at all, but the van matched it almost perfectly. The interior was lined with plywood and carpet. A wooden divider separated the driver's seat from the back, and on the dashboard hung the same feathered roach clip Beverly had mentioned. When questioned, Edward explained that the van wasn't his. It belonged to his boss, a man called Robin Gecht, and he was actually on his way to meet him right now. So the detectives told him to take them to him. When they arrived, they were introduced to Robin Gecht. He was tall, thin, had greasy hair, and was wearing a flannel shirt and square-toed boots. At the very least, his outfit was a perfect match for Beverly's description. But it wasn't just his appearance that disturbed the detectives. It was his calm. He smiled when he saw them, nodded politely. He even asked them what the problem was, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be cleared up in a few minutes. When they told him they needed to talk about his van, Robin agreed without hesitation and followed them to the station like a man with nothing to hide. There was no fear, no panic. It was a moment of either mistaken identity or a chilling encounter with a true psychopath. At the Area 5 headquarters, detectives separated the two men. They searched the van while others began the first of many interviews with them. In the glove compartment, they found a single pill, later confirmed to be a sedative, just like the one Beverly had been forced to swallow. They also found several knives among the clutter in the back. Edward's interrogation started slowly. At first, he denied everything, claiming ignorance of any assaults or murders. But as the hours passed, his composure began to crack. He constantly looked at the door, as though afraid his boss might walk in at any moment. When the investigators pressed harder, he finally broke. And the confession that poured out of him over the next several hours would end up filling 78 pages worth of transcript. First, he admitted he'd been behind the wheel the night a man named Rafael Tirado was shot down near a phone booth, a detail detectives were able to quickly verify. From there, the story only got darker. He said Robin prowled the city in his red van, picking up women at random, sometimes sex workers, sometimes women just walking home alone. They would then take them somewhere private, a motel, an alleyway, a basement, and the screaming would begin. Edward claimed they would handcuff their victims, assault them, and then slice away one or both of their breasts. Sometimes the women were alive when they did it, sometimes they were already dead. Edward told them that there were two other men who were part of what he called the group, Andrew and Thomas Cocorales, brothers from the nearby suburb of Elmhurst. He then told them that Robin kept a box filled with severed breasts in the attic of his Villa Park home, trophies of their victims. And after each killing, he said they would gather in that same attic, where Robin had created what he called his satanic chapel. And there, the ritual would begin. Robin would place a breast on a small altar, read passages from the Satanic Bible, and make the others masturbate over it. Then he would slice the flesh into small pieces and force them to eat it, in a twisted mockery of the act of communion. On more than one occasion, he said, Robin was so excited that he performed a sexual act on the severed flesh or open wound right there in the van. He depicted Robin as a man consumed by an insatiable bloodlust during the murders. He claimed he once shot a woman in the head, weighting her down with bowling balls in water so she would never be found. That he bludgeoned another woman to death with a hammer. That he hacked off a woman's breast in an alley while she was still alive, before engaging in sexual acts with the wound. That he mercilessly beat a woman with an axe. The detectives were stunned. The crimes he described were almost too grotesque to believe, scenes of torture, mutilation, and ritual cannibalism carried out in a suburban home while Robin's wife and children slept downstairs. But Edward's details were specific. He knew things only the killers could know: the wounds, the tools, the exact sequence of events. When investigators brought Robin into the interrogation room, he was polite, even charming. He joked with the officers, made small talk about his construction business, and denied every accusation. When they confronted him with Edward's confession, his expression didn't even change. He just claimed to have no idea what they were talking about as he looked them straight in the eyes and smiled. To rattle him, the detectives led him past the adjacent room where Edward was still talking. Through the glass, he could see his accomplice weeping as he described the murders in graphic detail. But Robin didn't flinch. Inside that room, however, the sight of Robin changed everything. The moment Edward locked eyes with his boss, he froze, turned pale, and suddenly recanted everything he'd just said. He claimed Robin was innocent and blamed the murders entirely on Andrew Coccoralis instead. In that singular moment, the investigators realised what they were dealing with. This wasn't just fear, it was control. Everyone who knew Robin Gecht would go on to describe the same thing: a strange magnetic pull. People obeyed him without understanding why. His wife later told police he could talk anyone into doing anything. His followers said the same. They called it his power. One acquaintance even warned the investigators never to meet his gaze, afraid that he would be able to somehow ensnare them if they did. When police questioned Andrew and Thomas Coccoralis, the same pattern repeated itself: denials, followed by small cracks, followed by collapse. Andrew was the first to break. His statement confirmed nearly every detail from Edward's confession. He described how the group had stalked women in the van, abducting them at random. He said they'd used knives, piano wire, and even can openers to mutilate their victims. He told the detectives that Robin believed the women's breasts contained spiritual power, and that by eating them they could absorb it and become stronger. His confession mirrored everything Edward had told them about their disturbing practices of communion, which he called satanic rituals. All in all, he confessed to as many as 18 murders, including the murders of Lorraine Borowski and Rose Beck Davis. And when he talked about Sandra Delaware, he gave details no outsider would know, including the rock forced into her mouth to stop her screaming, and wounds that perfectly matched the coroner's report. Thomas, who was the youngest and arguably the most impressionable of the group, was the last to be questioned. He was slow, almost childlike, and appeared easily led to the detectives. After failing a polygraph test, he finally broke down. He told them that Robin would curse or kill them if they disobeyed him, and he seemed to genuinely believe it. He described the attic, filled with candles, 6 red and black crosses painted on the wall, and an altar with red cloth. And of course, the box. According to him, there were 15 breasts inside it when he'd last seen it. When a detective asked what they did up there, Thomas stared at the table and whispered, "We'd take communion." He added another line investigators would never forget: "You just have to do it." During his recorded confession, Thomas admitted to being present during 3 murders, including that of Lorraine Borowski. Piece by piece, the confessions lined up: the van, the implements, the ritual, the victims. Still, prosecutors faced a major obstacle. There was almost no physical evidence linking any of them to the murders. Most of what they'd said was public knowledge, with only a few small details that only the actual killers could have known. And there was nothing at all directly tying Robin to the murders. When police served the warrant and finally climbed into Robin's attic, it was exactly as the 3 men had described. There were candles, an altar, and even a rifle that was later matched to the shooting of Rafael Tirado. But the fabled trophy box containing the breasts was gone. Whether it had been destroyed, hidden, or never existed the way the men recalled, no one ever found it. But the investigators pressed on. Running background checks, they found Robin had been charged 2 years earlier with contributing to the sexual delinquency of a 14-year-old girl. They even discovered that Robin had rented a room at the same motel where Linda Sutton's body was found for an extended period in 1981. Edward and the 2 Coccoralis brothers had also rented 3 adjoining rooms, long enough to need to redirect mail from the address. The motel manager vividly remembered them, saying they brought women back to their rooms at all hours of the night and described them as some kind of cultists involved in devil worship. But much more shockingly, before the killings began, they discovered that Robin had actually worked for another infamous serial killer, someone who had buried dozens of young men beneath his house, John Wayne Gacy. During Gacy's trial, he had hinted that he hadn't acted entirely alone and that he'd worked with an accomplice. One of the victims initially attributed to Gacy was later found to have been murdered when he was out of town, and Gacy explained that this was the work of his accomplice, who had murdered without his consent. He never named that man. But when detectives compared dates and locations, the possibility became difficult to ignore. Robin had worked for Gacy's PDM contractors during the exact time period as some of the killings Gacy claimed were committed by someone else. It could have been a coincidence, but none of the detectives could shake the feeling that they'd finally found the elusive accomplice, and that they were staring into the eyes of a monster who'd learned how to murder behind a smile from one of history's most notorious serial killers. When asked about Gacy, Robin simply smirked. He then said that his only mistake was keeping the bodies under his house. It was the only time his mask slipped. When the news broke, the city could hardly process it. 4 men, all from ordinary suburbs, all seemingly harmless, were accused of committing some of the most sadistic murders in Illinois history. Reporters swarmed the police stations, demanding details. And by late 1982, they had already given the 4 men in custody a variety of nicknames like the Chicago Rippers or the Ripper Crew. But behind those ordinary faces was a darkness that had been building for years, one that began, detectives believed, with Robin Gecht. Robin was born on November 30th, 1953, as the eldest of 3 children. He grew up in a modest Chicago home and was quiet and bookish, at least on the surface. But from an early age, people began to notice something strange about him. He was intelligent, but he was also manipulative, and he seemed uncomfortably fascinated by pain. According to later reports, Robin had molested his own sister when he was a teenager, and as a result, his parents sent him to live with his grandmother, hoping the distance would somehow fix him. Though Robin has always denied this accusation. By his early 20s, he was working in construction. Outwardly, he was charming and articulate, and to most people he just seemed like a normal guy. He married a woman called Rose, had 3 children, and rented a modest house. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was a typical family man. But inside that home, things were far from normal. Rose told investigators that her husband kept a small room in the attic locked at all times, which he forbade her from entering. When she asked what was inside, he told her it was his place of meditation. She noticed other things too: his obsession with pornography, his unpredictable moods, his fixation on women's breasts. He even sometimes carried knives to bed. On one occasion, she said he'd cut her breast during sex with a razor. Afterwards, he asked her if he could do it again as a symbol of love. When she refused, he became enraged, but at the time, she told no one about it. Robin's construction company employed several young men from the neighborhood. One of them was Edward Spreitzer, a quiet redhead who looked up to him like a father figure. Edward was barely out of his teens when he met Robin, and he was lonely and eager to belong, a weakness Robin instantly spotted and instantly began taking advantage of. Through Edward came Andrew and Thomas Kokoralis, 2 brothers from a devout Greek family in the same area. Andrew was in his 20s and was intelligent but easily influenced. Thomas was younger, slower, and desperate for acceptance. What started as casual nights of drinking and talk about satanic rituals soon escalated into something else. A distorted belief that Robin, their leader, was chosen for a higher purpose. Robin told them that God had abandoned the world, and that true power could only be found through pain. He called their acts of violence offerings. And in his attic, he built their chapel, where the group would gather after his wife had left to work her night shifts and his children had gone to bed. The walls were covered in red and black crosses painted in crude strokes, and at the centre stood an altar draped in red cloth on which he'd placed the severed breasts of his victims. Here, Robin would read passages from the Satanic Bible, forcing his followers to repeat them. The ceremonies ended with each man masturbating over the remains and then consuming small pieces of flesh, or as they called it, taking communion. To the investigators who heard those accounts, the line between religion and madness had never looked thinner. But what baffled them the most was how Robin was able to maintain such control over his followers. They weren't hardened criminals. None of them had prior convictions. Yet they had committed acts so depraved, so disgusting, and so vicious at his command. How could any normal person possibly be swayed into doing such evil and disturbing things? Psychologists later compared Robin to Charles Manson, a manipulator who preyed on broken people, reshaping them into extensions of his will. Just like Manson, Robin cloaked his sadism in a twisted form of spiritual enlightenment. During the interrogations, all three of them described Robin's influence in the same way: hypnotic, suffocating, impossible to escape. Edward said he'd vomited after one of the murders, only for Robin to force him to continue. Andrew claimed Robin could make you do things just by looking at you, and that even when he wasn't there, he could feel his presence. For police, that kind of fear made prosecution difficult. Edward and the brothers spoke freely about their own roles in the murders and ritualistic acts, but when it came to Robin, their voices got small. They'd look at the floor, and they'd say the same thing over and over: "You just have to do it." Even in custody, he still held a weird kind of power over them. So they did what they could. They showed Beverly Washington a photo array at the hospital, and she picked out Robin as her attacker. It wasn't enough to charge him with murder, but it was the first time the survivors' words, the motel ledgers, and the van all pointed to the same man. Ultimately, the Ripper crew had admitted to at least 18 murders. But with little physical evidence, and some of the missing women mentioned in the confessions never even being found, the investigators could only definitively tie them to 8. With Edward having recanted his initial accusations against Robin, there was nothing at all tying him directly to the murders. And all three of them refused to implicate him, or to testify against him, clearly too afraid of the supernatural abilities they believed he possessed. So there was enough to link him to some of the crimes, but not to any specific act of murder. In the early 1980s, forensic science wasn't what it is today. There was no DNA testing available and no advanced trace analysis that could be done. So without the trophy box or direct witnesses, the case against Robin was surprisingly thin. But it was clear to everyone that if anything, Robin was more culpable than his 3 followers. He was the ringleader, the mastermind, the manipulator, and more than likely the actual murderer in the majority of the cases. So it became vitally important to make sure they could charge him with something that would stick and keep him behind bars for as long as possible. So they built the strongest non-homicide case they could, with the help of the 2 survivors, Beverly Washington and Angel York, and charged him with attempted murder, assault, and aggravated battery. It was a bitter compromise, but it was the best they could do unless one of the others decided to turn on him. As his trial approached, Robin remained calm and articulate. He smiled for reporters, charmed his lawyers, and wrote letters insisting on his innocence and that he'd never killed anyone in his life. Robin tried to sidestep the trial entirely with an insanity claim, but the court psychiatrists that examined him found he was competent to stand trial and legally sane at the time of the offences. A mistrial then followed on procedural grounds, before his second trial finally began on September 20th, 1983. The state's exhibit list was unsettling. During the search, detectives had photographed and seized a variety of items from the attic chapel, including candles, the draped altar cloth, satanic literature, and even the rifle confirmed to have been used in the Tirado shooting. They also took a wooden box the state argued was consistent with what the others had described as the trophy box, though no human tissue was ever recovered from it. Both Beverly and Angel testified against him, pointing him out as their attacker, as the prosecutors walked the jury through a pattern. Women abducted, restrained, tortured, sexually assaulted, and mutilated. Other women from Robin's past also testified that he'd pressured them during sex to let him cut their breasts. What the jury did not hear were the co-defendants' murder confessions about Robin. Under confrontation rules, statements by Edward or the Coccorales brothers couldn't be used against Robin unless they testified and faced cross-examination, which they refused to do. That meant the state could prove methods and ritual in regards to the other murders of the Ripper crew, but not who actually committed the act in any particular murder case. Robin took the stand in his own defense. He admitted contact with Beverly, but insisted that he hadn't killed anyone and wasn't guilty of any of the charges. He claimed that during the period when most of the murders occurred, he barely knew or wasn't even acquainted with the others. He stayed calm and composed even when shown graphic photos and told gruesome crime scene details. Though this actually backfired, as the jurors would later state that how unnaturally calm and unreactive he was to the horrific evidence actually made him seem more psychopathic and more guilty. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding him guilty on all charges, and as a result, the judge sentenced him to 120 years in prison. He showed no reaction to the verdict, and from that day forward, he kept the line he still uses in letters to this day, that he's innocent and that he never killed anyone. Next came the murder trials for the 3 remaining members of the Ripper crew. They were not masterminds, not visionaries, not even particularly intelligent. What united them was obedience, a willingness to follow Robin's commands to the point of atrocity, and in their cases, it was much easier to prove what they'd done. During the early hearings for Thomas Kokoralis, his defense argued that he'd been manipulated into confessing and that his low IQ of 75 made him vulnerable to suggestion. But the prosecution felt the details he provided were impossible to ignore. He just knew too much to be innocent. In his confession, he'd described the red van, the abductions, and the attic filled with candles and red cloth. He'd talked about knives, piano wire, and communion, and most importantly, he'd mentioned a woman he recognized, a woman he said they'd dumped in a cemetery. Her name was Lorraine Borowski. Thomas's confession matched the autopsy in disturbing detail, and he'd even pointed out the exact spot outside the Remax office where she'd been abducted from. For the prosecutors in DuPage County, it was enough to build a case against him. Unlike the other victims, spread across multiple jurisdictions and lacking direct evidence, Lorraine's murder could be tied to Thomas through his own words. It didn't rely on the others' confessions, which couldn't legally be used against him. So they charged him with the assault and first-degree murder of Lorraine. At trial, Thomas's defense argued that he'd been manipulated and coerced, not by Robin, but by the detectives, who they claimed had twisted his words and exploited his limited intelligence. But the confession was allowed to stand, and on May 18, 1984, a jury found him guilty of the murder of Lorraine Borowski. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, and even Thomas, who had wept throughout the interrogations, showed almost no reaction. He was sentenced to life in prison, but his story didn't end there. In 1986, Thomas's attorneys appealed, arguing that parts of his confession had been improperly handled. And the appeals court actually agreed, reversing his assault conviction and ordering a new trial on the murder charge. Rather than face another jury and the possibility of a harsher outcome, Thomas took a deal. He pleaded guilty to Lorraine's murder in exchange for a 70-year sentence. In return, the state agreed not to pursue charges in respect to any of the other murders he had once mentioned in his confession, such as the murder of Linda Sutton. Under the Illinois laws in effect when he was sentenced, he was allowed something called day-for-day credit, a kind of good behaviour incentive that meant every day served counted as 2. As a result, in 2017, Thomas became eligible for parole, prompting authorities to attempt to have him committed as a sexually violent person, which would stop him from being released. To do this, they needed to establish that it was substantially probable that he would commit further acts of sexual violence if released. References were made to his numerous confessions and the various statements he'd made to detectives and attorneys over the years, in which he detailed his involvement in the assaults of other Ripper crew victims, such as Schweimack. But when psychiatrists evaluated him in 2017, they concluded that he didn't meet the legal criteria to be classified as a sexually violent person under Illinois law. Despite that, he was actually denied release because he failed to find a suitable place to live on the outside. However, just 2 years later, in March of 2019, after serving 35 years behind bars, Thomas's sentence was over and he walked out of prison. He wasn't on parole. He wasn't on probation. He was simply registered as a sex offender and allowed to walk free. Thomas then returned to the Chicago suburbs, where residents flooded local police lines with calls of anger and disbelief and began protesting near the apartment he moved into. But legally, there wasn't much anyone could do. He had served his sentence as per Illinois law, and he was free. By the spring of 1985, prosecutors were ready to move on the elder of the 2 Kokoralis brothers, Andrew. He was set to face 2 separate murder trials in 2 different counties for 2 different women, Rose Beck Davis and Lorraine Borowski. The first trial was for the murder of Rosebeck Davis, the 30-year-old marketing executive who had been found savagely beaten and mutilated in a Gold Coast alleyway. Andrew's own confession had placed him at the scene. He told investigators he and the others had forced her into the red van, dragged her to a secluded spot, and that she was beaten to death with a hatchet. When the trial opened, prosecutors presented that confession in its entirety, Andrew's own words describing in horrifying detail what had been done to her. The jury didn't need long. After just over 3 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. And as a result, Andrew was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Rosebeck Davis. The second trial for Lorraine Borowski unfolded soon after. This time, Andrew changed everything. He withdrew every confession he'd given, all 4 of them, and insisted that the police had fabricated his statements. He said detectives had beaten him, threatened him, and even fed him details of the crimes to make his confessions believable. Prosecutor Brian Talander, an experienced and unflinching attorney, dismantled the claim. He walked the jury through each interrogation with 6 different detectives and 2 prosecutors and showed that there was 0 evidence of coercion. Andrew repeated his accusations, saying that every one of them had told him what to say. But then came the testimony that shattered his credibility. Detective Warren Wilcosh took the stand and described showing Andrew a photo lineup during questioning. Without hesitation, Andrew had pointed to a young woman and said, "That's the girl Eddie Spreitzer and I killed in the cemetery." That woman was Lorraine Borowski. The trial came down to a question of credibility. Who was the jury going to believe? 8 officers and prosecutors, or the man now claiming they'd all conspired against him? Andrew sat sullen and defiant throughout the proceedings. But the jury didn't believe his story. After little more than an hour of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. And this time they recommended he receive the death penalty. At his sentencing, Andrew once again denied the killings. His lawyers argued for mercy, saying there was no evidence of premeditation and that his behaviour in custody showed that he could be rehabilitated. A prison chaplain and a counsellor even testified that he was quiet, compliant, and capable of reform. But none of it mattered. The court upheld the death sentence, and in 1989, his appeals were denied. Over the next decade, Andrew's legal team tried everything to stop his execution from being carried out. They filed motion after motion, arguing that his defense had failed him. They argued that his trial lawyers should have pursued an insanity defense, seeing it as a massive oversight that they'd not done a psychiatric evaluation at the time of his trial, and argued that if they had, he likely would have been found unfit to stand trial. They pointed to prison psychiatric notes describing him as emotionally unstable and suffering from borderline personality disorder. Despite the fact that this diagnosis did not actually render him legally insane or incompetent to stand trial. Ultimately, the appeals court wasn't convinced. Instead, they ruled that there was no obvious pattern of abnormal behaviour and no reason to suspect a psychiatric disorder, and that his trial had been handled properly. And so, the death sentence stood, with his execution set for March 17, 1999. But by the late 90s, Illinois was reeling from growing evidence of wrongful convictions on death row. A wave of investigative reporting from the Chicago Tribune revealed that at least a dozen inmates awaiting execution had later been exonerated, some by DNA, others by proof of police misconduct. In the days leading up to his execution, his lawyers pleaded with Governor George Ryan for clemency. Illinois Supreme Court Justice Moses Harrison even issued an emergency stay in his case while calling for a statewide pause on all executions. But just hours before his execution, the Illinois Supreme Court overturned the stay in a 4-3 vote. Governor Ryan issued a brief 3-page statement. The courts had spoken. The appeals had been heard. The law would stand. So on the morning of March 17th, Andrew was moved to the Tams Correctional Center, a supermax prison in southern Illinois, where he spent his final hours in prayer and fasting. He phoned a few close friends to say goodbye. He wept and prayed with his brother Thomas, and he clung to the hope that the governor would intervene. But his salvation never came. At 12:34 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney, offered an apology to the Borowski family, and whispered that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. Then he was killed by lethal injection. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. A man who once claimed to serve Satan died believing he was going home to God. Within a year, Governor Ryan would announce a statewide moratorium on the death penalty, which eventually led to Illinois abolishing capital punishment altogether. But for Andrew, it came too late, and he became the last man executed in Illinois history. On April 2, 1984, before either of the Cockerales brothers entered the court, Edward Spreitzer chose to make a plea instead of facing a trial. He stood before a Cook County judge and pled guilty to 4 murders: Rosebeck Davis, Sandra Delaware, Schwaymack, and Rafael Tirado. He also admitted to multiple counts of sexual assault and armed violence. The court sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms for the 4 murders, plus a number of additional years for the other charges. But the prosecutors in DuPage County were adamant they wanted his life for what he'd done, and there was still one more murder case they felt they could prove he was guilty in. The one that started it all. The murder of Linda Sutton, the woman found behind the Brer Rabbit Motel. So on February 25, 1986, Edward entered the courtroom in DuPage County to stand trial for the murder of Linda with the death sentence on the table. Edward's account of what happened painted a picture of pure horror. He claimed they picked Linda up near Wrigley Field before handcuffing her, assaulting her, and eventually cutting off her breasts and leaving her body in the field behind the motel. Witness after witness took the stand: detectives, medical examiners, acquaintances, each of them building a portrait of a young man who'd followed a monster, before at some point he'd become one himself. His public defender, Carol Ann Finson, tried to make the jury see him differently. She described him as immature, impulsive, and easily led. According to her, he was a simple young man who'd been manipulated by a sadistic cult leader, a frightened follower, not a willing murderer. She called his friends and relatives to testify. They described him as gentle, quiet, and childlike, the kind of person who'd been bullied all his life and was desperate to belong. But then one of his friends began revealing things the defense had not expected. He told the court that Edward had laughed about the killings and that he'd even bragged about mutilating and murdering his victims like it was a story meant to impress. As you can imagine, the prosecution jumped on his statements. They called Edward every woman's nightmare and labelled him as a weasel who hunted with his pack, feeding off each other's depravity. On March 4, 1986, Judge Edward Cowell found him guilty of aggravated kidnapping and murder. 2 weeks later, on March 20th, a jury deliberated for barely an hour before returning the sentence the state had demanded: death. Edward was then transferred to death row at the Pontiac Correctional Center in Pontiac, Illinois, to await his execution. Over the next several years, his attorneys filed one appeal after another. One of his later lawyers, Gary Pritchard, argued that the trial had been unfair, claiming the judge had failed to properly instruct the jury. Just like with Andrew, they argued that Edward's mental condition hadn't been considered. They claimed that a post-trial examination revealed signs of brain damage and evidence that Edward's IQ was low enough to call his comprehension into question. But every appeal they filed came back with the exact same response: denied. By the late 1990s, he had no avenues left to explore. He was set to be executed. But unlike Andrew, the legal change in the state came before his execution could be carried out. In October 2002, Edward, now 41 years old, was among 140 inmates whose cases were re-examined under the state's new stance on executions. His lawyers once again pleaded for mercy, claiming Edward had an IQ of 76, was raised in a violent environment, and was easily controlled by men like Robin Gecht, claiming his fear of his former leader had influenced everything he'd done. But the families of his victims were having none of it. They packed the hearings and gave interviews calling him the personification of evil. One prosecutor even told reporters he was the worst of the worst. It didn't seem like he stood a chance of avoiding execution. At least not until January 11, 2003, when Governor George Ryan announced blanket clemency for every inmate on Illinois' death row, as described earlier. 4 men were pardoned outright, and 164 more, including Edward, had their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment. The families of the victims were horrified. Some said it felt like the murders were being forgotten, or worse, forgiven. Others said it only proved that the justice system itself was as broken as the man it had condemned. On November 16, 1988, tragedy struck what remained of the Gecht family. Robin's mother Loretta, his sister Rochelle, and his nephew Nicholas were on their way home after visiting him in prison when they were involved in a car accident. On the highway, their car was crushed between two semi-trucks, resulting in the instant deaths of Loretta and Nicholas. Rochelle lingered in a coma for 4 months, before eventually succumbing to her injuries. Around a decade later, Robin's son David was also arrested and charged with first-degree murder in March of 1999. At just 18 years old, he was said to have shot and killed Roberto Cruz in northwest Chicago. He was tried as an adult and received a 45-year prison sentence. For many, it felt like a grim echo of his father's legacy, another life twisted by proximity to a monster. However, not everything was quite as it seemed. It later turned out that his conviction was tied to a broader pattern of misconduct by Detective Ronaldo Guevara, who was found to have coerced confessions through violence, to have tampered with evidence, and to have forced witnesses to provide false identifications with threats and violence. As a result, David was granted a new trial on May 25, 2022, and he was formally exonerated 2 months later. He then filed a federal civil rights suit against Cook County, who ended up settling for just over $3 million. He was one of more than 40 people found to have been wrongfully convicted in cases linked to Detective Guevara. His father, meanwhile, is still serving his sentence behind bars at the Danville Correctional Center in Illinois. Over the years, Robin has written a number of letters, continuing to proclaim his innocence. In one, he said, "First mistake is considering me a serial killer. I have never killed or took part in any such acts, nor ever been charged in any murders of anyone." He has used this technicality since the day he was imprisoned, because technically, Robin was never charged with murder and has never been proven to have directly killed anybody. But it's clear as day to everyone, every detective, every family member, everyone who ever encountered him, even everyone who just reads about his case, that Robin is a monster responsible for taking many lives in the most brutal and depraved ways imaginable. Robin himself, however, has asserted dozens of times that he believes DNA testing will eventually exonerate him, and he will walk free as a result. So far, he's been unsuccessful. In interviews, he later described his obsession with women's breasts as familial, claiming every man in his family had shared it. "It is a thing with my entire family," he wrote to author Jennifer Furio in 1993. "Each of us men has married large-breasted women. My ex-wife was a 39D, and yes, she was very satisfying to me." When Furio asked whether he'd ever been sexually aroused by the breast mutilations, he denied it, saying, "Only a very sick person would even think of that." Detective Warren Wilcox would later describe him as the most evil man I've ever met in an interview. He had been asked how he felt about Thomas's release from prison, which he claimed he didn't have any strong opinions about. However, he emphasized that Robin's potential parole would be a whole different thing. As in his words, "He made Manson look like a Boy Scout." If Robin actually lives to see his next parole hearing in 2042, he will be almost 90 years old. By contrast, Edward will never be released, given his initial death sentence was converted to life without the possibility of parole. Prison psychologists have described him as quiet, compliant, and eager to please, and it's reported that he now spends most of his time reading the Bible, having claimed to have found peace. Thomas, the one member of the Ripper crew to walk free, is living in a Christian rehabilitation facility in or near Peoria, Illinois, as of 2024. In recent interviews, he's been quoted as saying, "Everybody thinks I'm a monster. I'm not a monster." He appears to show no remorse in the interviews he's done, claiming he is completely innocent. He has stated he was wrongfully convicted for crimes he didn't commit, and that he had no participation in or knowledge of any of the murders or assaults. Instead, he claims the police fed him the specific details he revealed in his confessions, and that at the time of Lorraine Borowski's murder, he was actually with his father, visiting his mother's grave. Lorraine's younger brother told reporters that Thomas being out makes him feel sick to his stomach, while her mother was quoted saying, "I will never understand how a man who is convicted of raping and murdering my daughter could be walking free in Illinois today. My daughter was an innocent victim. Her murderer did not receive the justice that he deserved, but I believe in God, and I have no doubt that God will deliver the final judgment." In response, Thomas has coldly told reporters, "They want to see me back behind the bars, permanently. But they got to deal with it. I'm out." Forensic psychologist Dr. Eric Hickey, who examined over 300 serial killers, later classified the Ripper crew as one of the most extreme examples of team murder syndrome in history. Cases where individuals who might not kill alone become capable of horrific violence under the influence of a dominant leader. Hickey noted that in every instance, one person completely and utterly dominated in these kind of groups, which in this case was Robin. He also noted that such killers often feed off each other's presence, writing, "In these partnerships, the act of murder becomes a shared experience of power. Each participant loses individuality, and the group itself becomes the killer." Similarly, several criminologists studying the case have argued that Robin's hold over the others functioned like a shared psychosis, a form of collective delusion where one dominant personality imposes their fantasy onto others until they lose their own moral compass entirely. But a lot of people, particularly the families of the victims, see things differently. They argue that there was no hypnosis, no psychosis, and no supernatural hold, just weakness and willful surrender. And that at the core of the Ripper crew wasn't religion or Satan or madness. It was choice. Each of them chose to follow Robin's orders. Each of them chose to abuse, mutilate, and kill. And that isn't something anybody, no matter how scary or how powerful you believe them to be, could convince most of us to do if we didn't want to. To this day, it remains unclear just how many women the four men killed together. Detectives claim to have confirmed 18 victims of the Ripper crew, including a number of mutilated sex workers who have never been identified. More than 40 years later, although the Brer Rabbit Motel still stands, the open field behind it has long been paved over. But for those who remember the case, that patch of ground will always be the place where Chicago first glimpsed the evil it had been living beside. If you walk there now, you'd never know what once happened. You'd never guess that under that asphalt, police once stood ankle-deep in rainwater, staring down at a body that would open the door to one of the darkest cult killings in American history. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the Chicago Ripper crew comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and comment down below, or whatever else YouTube and its hungry gods are demanding of you these days. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked in the description down below. They're really just there for you to make a gesture of support right now, though you will get your name featured at the end of my videos if you do join, alongside all the lovely folks appearing on screen in a few seconds. In all honesty, watching and engaging is the most helpful thing anybody can do for my videos right now, so please don't feel any pressure. The world is a tough place right now for all of us, so just giving me your time and support is truly, truly appreciated. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. January 6, 2007. In Knoxville, Tennessee, 21-year-old sociology student Shannon Christian finishes work and heads over to her friend Kara's apartment to get ready for a party together. Meanwhile, her 23-year-old boyfriend, Christopher Newsom, catches up with his best friend Josh, planning to pick her up once she's ready so the two of them can go to dinner together and then join everyone else at the party later. Although the couple have only been dating for a couple of months, they're already deeply infatuated with each other, and so spend the entire evening texting back and forth, looking forward to a fun night in each other's company. But by 8 p.m., with Chris running behind, Shannon tells Kara to head off to the party without her, where she'll join her later. At the party, Kara spots Chris dropping Josh off, so she calls Shannon to tell her that he's finally on his way over to meet her. Although a little annoyed at him when he arrives at long last, Shannon quickly forgives him and begins laughing and joking with him as they head down to the parking lot, trying to decide where they should go to eat. Beside Shannon's SUV, they share a hug and a kiss, completely unaware that they're being watched, because in that moment, they have just been spotted by a group of violent criminals. Suddenly, 3 men swarm them, pointing guns at them. Unable to even process what's happening, Chris and Shannon are shoved into the back of the SUV at gunpoint. With one of their attackers at the wheel, the others bind their hands behind their backs and blindfold them both. Trapped and terrified, the couple have no idea what's happening as they're driven to a nearby house. And when they reach it, the situation quickly escalates, transforming from an apparent carjacking into what can only be described as a genuine living nightmare. The next morning, Shannon's mother Dina checks in on her daughter to find that she still hasn't returned home from the party. With no missed calls and Shannon's phone going straight to voicemail, Dina soon discovers from Cara that Shannon and Chris never arrived at the party last night, nor had they informed her or anyone else they wouldn't be attending. In fact, at around 11 p.m. the previous night, two of their friends had gone to the parking lot to check on the couple, where they found Chris's truck, but no sign of Shannon's SUV. Then Shannon's workplace calls the house, telling her that she didn't show up for her shift that morning. And when Dina contacts Chris's parents, they're just as confused over why their son also hasn't returned home. So the two families call the police to report them as missing. But as Shannon and Christopher are both adults, they're told they're free to come and go as they wish, and informed they need to wait at least 24 hours before they can file an official report. But this isn't actually true, it's just a common tactic used by the police to avoid triggering an investigation into someone who will more than likely show up later that day. Unfortunately, this wasn't going to be one of those situations. Knowing something isn't right, the parents of Chris and Shannon instead join up with some of the couple's friends and begin searching for them themselves, going to the parking lot where they were last seen, calling local hospitals and checking in with everyone who might know where they are. They even managed to get Shannon's cell phone provider to give them location data, revealing that her phone last pinged at a tower on Cherry Street in northeast Knoxville, around 6 miles from the parking lot. If they weren't already worried enough, this amplifies their fears, as the Cherry Street area is known for its high crime rate, including illegal activities like buying and selling drugs and weapons. After organising a door-to-door search around the area, on January 8th they managed to find the SUV abandoned at an intersection on Cherry Street. But somebody has removed the window stickers from the car, alongside Shannon's various belongings, such as her iPod and phone charger, and the stuffed bear and photograph she always kept on her dashboard. And the usually spotless car has mud all over the floor. Perhaps most concerning for the families, the driver's seat has been shifted back way further than Shannon would ever adjust it, to the point that she would have been unable to even reach the pedals. There is no doubt in their minds that someone else had been driving her car. This time, when they call the police, their concerns are taken seriously, with investigators arriving to impound the vehicle for forensic analysis and take details about the couple. But what the families don't yet know is that the day before, the police had already been notified of a horrific discovery. At around midday on the 7th, a Norfolk Southern Railway worker stumbled across the badly burned body of an adult male on the tracks, immediately contacting the police. While the families were busy searching for Shannon's SUV, the police began analysing the remains. The victim was found wrapped in a comforter with a sweatshirt around his head to secure a sock gag. A belt had been tied around his ankles, with a shoelace tying his wrists behind his back. He had been sexually assaulted before being shot 3 times execution style, doused in gasoline, and set on fire, which unfortunately destroyed any potential forensic evidence. Sadly, they soon confirmed that the body belongs to Chris, advising his family not to view the remains due to the severe nature of his death. Hearing the news, his mother, Mary, collapses in shock, and ignoring their advice, she chooses to see her son's body, wrapping her arms around the body bag as she cries, promising she'll meet him again one day. While this discovery is obviously chilling, it raises one huge, disturbing question. Where is Shannon? Given her body wasn't found with Chris, her family cling to the hope that she's still alive, and their discovery of her SUV provides some immediate clues as to where she may be. Inside the vehicle, the police discover an envelope with the address 2316 Chipman Street written on it, which is only a few blocks away from where it had been found. They also recover fingerprints from the car and quickly identify who they belong to, given his extensive criminal history, and he just so happens to currently be living at the address written on the envelope. His name was Lamarcus Davidson, and he was a known criminal who had only just gotten out of prison after finishing a 5-year sentence. So the Knoxville Police and the Knox County Sheriff's Office secure a search warrant for 2316 Chipman Street, arriving on January 9th at the rundown home. But when they knock on the door, they receive no response. So they force their way inside, unaware that they're about to uncover one of the most gruesome and shocking crimes in the history of Tennessee. But be warned before we continue, this case is particularly disturbing and difficult to hear about. When I mentioned earlier that what happened was like a living nightmare, I wasn't exaggerating or being hyperbolic. What happened to Christopher and Shannon that night is one of the most harrowing crimes I've ever come across. It isn't something that's going to leave your mind quickly, and the sheer evil and brutality behind what happened can feel overwhelming and terrifying. But I think it's important that we don't forget or ignore what happened, and that Christopher and Shannon have their stories told. So with all that in mind then, this is the story of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, or as it's maybe better known, the Knoxville Horror. Shannon Gale Christian was born in Texas on April 29, 1985, with her family relocating to a middle-class neighborhood in Knoxville when she was 12 years old. From a young age, she had a close relationship with her mother, Dina, who described her as joyful and loving, and both she and her brother Chase quickly settled into the area and formed close friendships. One of her closest friends was Cara, who was more like a sister to her than anything else. Shannon was at her apartment so regularly that the two joked she may as well live there. Studying sociology at the University of Tennessee, Shannon was on track to graduate in December 2007. She lived at home with her parents and worked 2 jobs, which allowed her to buy her silver Toyota 4Runner, which she used to commute to school and work and to start saving for her future. And she had big dreams for that future, including wanting to have 4 children of her own, hoping to replicate the relationship she had with her own parents. Her boyfriend, Hugh Christopher Newsom Jr., was fractionally older than her, born on September 21, 1983, and had lived in Knoxville his entire life. Throughout his time at school, Chris's peers were often surprised by how kind and compassionate he was. Despite being popular, he frequently befriended other kids who had been bullied or ostracized and tried to help whoever he could, such as taking a lonely girl to prom when he realized she was going to have to go alone. Chris also showed both an artistic flair and a talent for sports, particularly baseball. He even played for the Hall's high school Red Devils, with many expecting him to pursue a career in the sport. However, after attending community college, Chris instead briefly worked as a motorcycle mechanic before finding his true calling to be carpentry, discovering that he really enjoyed the artistic freedom of woodworking. Meeting through mutual friends, Chris and Shannon fell quickly for each other, becoming inseparable almost immediately. Although they had only been dating for a couple of months since November 2006, they had already introduced each other to their families and had even begun discussing plans for a potential future together. Both of their parents and all of their friends were surprised at how happy they were and how well suited they seemed for each other. Sharing a close-knit friend group, Chris would often play golf with his best friend Josh while Shannon would hang out with Clara. And that was exactly what happened on the night of January 6, 2007. While Chris and Shannon shared a kiss beside her SUV, they had no idea they were being watched from another vehicle. Inside were 3 individuals. Lamarcus Davidson, a criminal who had recently been released from prison after serving 5 years for carjacking and robbery. His brother, Latalvis Cobbins, who had travelled down from Kentucky. And Lamarcus's friend, Eric Boyd. Together, they planned to steal a car to sell, and they'd already spent the night cruising around the area in a car borrowed from Eric's cousin, looking for the right victim. After Lamarcus and Eric forced Chris and Shannon into the back of the SUV at gunpoint, tying their hands behind their backs and blindfolding them, they drove them over to Lamarcus's rented house at 2316 Chipman Street. Latalvis followed closely behind in their own vehicle. At the house, they were joined by Latalvis's girlfriend, Vanessa Coleman, and his friend, George Thomas, who had both travelled down from Kentucky with him. Bringing the couple inside, the group took Chris into a different room and stripped him of his clothes, stealing anything of value out of his pockets. With his hands and legs bound, a bandana covering his eyes, and his mouth gagged with his own socks, they then began assaulting him. First, they inserted an unknown object of some sort into him repeatedly. Then, they assaulted him themselves. Once they'd finished, the group then beat and attacked him. All the while, Shannon was forced to listen from another room in the house. Forcing Chris to stand despite his pain and injuries, they then dragged him out to the car and drove him to a remote area near the railroad tracks. With his hands and feet restrained, they forced him to walk barefoot in the mud, wearing nothing but a shirt, with some reports claiming he was dragged by a dog leash placed around his neck. He was still blindfolded, and his mouth was still gagged. Then one of the 3 men shot him with a .22 caliber pistol, once in the shoulder and once in the back, leaving him paralyzed, but alive. The third and final shot was taken at close range to his head, severing his brainstem and instantly ending his life. Hoping to conceal the murder, the 3 men covered his body with a comforter from the house, doused it in gasoline, and set him on fire, leaving him to burn. Back at the house, unaware that they'd just murdered her boyfriend, Shannon was left under the watch of Vanessa in a bedroom. Alone with her, had Vanessa wanted to help her escape or go and get help, having just witnessed what had been done to Chris, she had every opportunity to. But she didn't. When the four men returned, they immediately began subjecting Shannon to unimaginable torment in the bedroom. Remaining tied up, they beat and assaulted her over and over, with a level of cruelty and brutality that is hard to comprehend any person being capable of. She had been purposefully bound so that her most vulnerable areas were exposed, with her captors taking turns assaulting every part of her, even using a foreign object believed to have been a chair leg, causing substantial trauma. She was kicked and beaten multiple times, including being struck in the head and in the genitals, resulting in significant injuries and blood loss. At some point while all of this was going on, Lamarcus's on-again, off-again girlfriend, Daphne Sutton, arrived at the house to collect some belongings, as she'd just recently moved out. She was handed a bag of clothes but didn't check what was inside. Though she found the group to be acting strangely, she never saw Shannon or what the group had been doing to her. When she attempted to use the bathroom, she was told she wasn't allowed because Vanessa was in there. She was also prevented from entering the kitchen or the bedroom. When she later looked through the bag she'd been handed, she realized most of the clothes didn't belong to her. As you can probably guess, they would later be identified as belonging to Shannon. After hours of abuse, the group attempted to remove any DNA evidence that could link back to them by pouring bleach onto and inside of every part of Shannon's body. Despite all of this torture and torment, Shannon was still clinging to life when the group proceeded to hog-tie her with strips of bedding, wrapping her in 5 black trash bags. A plastic bag was then knotted around her head. They then shoved her into a trash bin in a tightly curled fetal position in the kitchen, wearing nothing but a camisole and a sweater. And after that, the group left. Wearing Chris's Nike shoes and using his cell phone, Lamarcus drove Shannon's stolen SUV over to Daphne's new apartment, telling her that his brother had left and taken his house keys, so he couldn't return home, convincing her to let him stay. He even gave her items of jewelry he had taken from Shannon. Alone in the sealed trash bin, Shannon slowly suffocated to death. She died sometime between the afternoon of January 7th and the afternoon of January 8th. Her eyes were still open when she died. After the discovery of Lamarcus's fingerprints in the abandoned SUV and the envelope with the Chipman Street address written on it, police arrived at the house with a search warrant on January 9th. And when nobody answered the door, they forced their way inside. Moving through the house, it wasn't long before they found a number of items belonging to Shannon and Chris, including Shannon's iPod, purse and shoes, and Chris's baseball cap and driver's license. They even found shell casings matching the caliber of the bullets used to kill Chris. When they opened the bin in the kitchen, they were met with the horrific sight of Shannon's dead body, wrapped tightly in the trash bags. After informing her family that they'd found her remains, they cordoned the house off as a crime scene and began trying to determine what had happened to her. Her body was covered in blood, bruises and cuts, with forensic examiners soon revealing the horrendous abuse she'd suffered at the hands of her captors. They were able to recover semen samples from her clothing, including the camisole and sweater she was wearing, and on the trash bag she had been wrapped in, they managed to recover multiple fingerprints, which once again belonged to Lamarcus. These included an entire palm print that suggested the bag had been heavy when he'd lifted it. His prints were even found on the various items belonging to both victims left scattered around the house. The medical examiner who conducted Shannon's autopsy made a point of highlighting that the assault she suffered was far beyond what could be considered typical. They emphasized the sheer brutality of what she'd endured and left the investigators shocked when they revealed that she'd still been alive when she'd been covered in bleach and left in the trash bin to suffocate. Now, knowing both Chris and Shannon had suffered some of the most extreme forms of violence and abuse imaginable, the investigators knew they needed to locate Lamarcus and anyone else involved as quickly as possible, triggering a huge manhunt to find them. At the same time, Daphne saw a news story about what had happened in the house she'd been living in only days earlier and confronted Lamarcus about it. He pleaded for her not to turn him in, claiming his brother was solely responsible for the crime and that he had nothing to do with it. Unsure what to do, she forced him to leave. So he went and joined back up with Eric. And later that night, the two men arrived at the apartment of Danielle Lightfoot, asking to stay the night. Unaware of what had happened, she agreed. While there, the two of them tried to use their contacts to find a way to get Lamarcus out of town. Though they had little success, given his face was all over the news and nobody wanted anything to do with him. By the following day, Danielle saw a news story discussing how Shannon's body had been found at Lamarcus's house, prompting her to order the pair to leave her apartment. With Lamarcus hiding in a nearby wooded area, Eric tried to find someone who'd give him a ride, but nobody was willing to help them. So early in the morning on January 11th, the two of them broke into a vacant house on Reynolds Street. While Lamarcus stayed at the house, Eric went out to get him McDonald's before heading to his mother's house, leaving his own phone with him in case he needed to contact him. However, he hadn't been aware that the police were also looking for him, as they'd found multiple phone calls between the two men during the time the couple had been missing, and it wasn't long before Knoxville police officers found him. Questioning him about Lamarcus's whereabouts, currently unaware of how involved he himself was in the horrific crimes, Eric initially denied knowing where his friend was. But with minimal pressure from the officers, he turned on his friend and provided them with the location where he was hiding. As a result, Eric was allowed to leave without further detention. Arriving at the vacant house around 4 p.m. that same day, the investigators arrested Lamarcus, who was still wearing Chris's Nike shoes. They also found the McDonald's bag they would later learn Eric had delivered to him, as well as Eric's cell phone and a .22 caliber revolver in his possession. During his interrogation, Lamarcus changed his story multiple times about what happened. At first, he claimed he hadn't been at the house at all and said he had no knowledge about anything that happened there. Then, he stated he actually had been there and that his brother Latalvis and his friend George Thomas had arrived around 10 p.m, claiming they'd carjacked two people who they'd brought with them in the car. According to him, he wanted nothing to do with it, so he went outside to smoke. And when he came back in around 20 minutes later, he claimed only Shannon was still in the house, with no idea what had happened to Chris. He claimed he then took Shannon's SUV to use for selling drugs in the area, before abandoning it and wiping it down. He adamantly denied that he was in any way involved in anything, assuring them his DNA would not be found on Shannon, as he had no sexual contact with her. I can only assume he genuinely and naively believed that the bleach had erased all traces of what he'd done to her. Later that day, Latalvis and George were arrested in Lebanon, Kentucky, with police finding a number of Shannon's items still in their possession. Examining their computer, they found that they'd been watching news reports about the murders. Just like Lamarcus, they both offered entirely different accounts of what happened, claiming they personally had no involvement. After Vanessa was mentioned by both men, she was also tracked down and arrested later that same day. With the four suspects in custody, while the investigators waited for their forensic results to come back, they tried to make sense of their conflicting stories. Among the many changing stories, Vanessa claimed that she'd been held hostage like Chris and Shannon and had been forced to watch and participate in what was happening. And Latalvis claimed that once the couple had been brought back to the house by Eric and Lamarcus took Shannon into the bedroom by himself, and Eric drove off with Chris, without him or George being involved in anything. However, while the semen recovered from Chris's body had been too damaged by the fire to identify who it belonged to, the samples found on Shannon's clothes, as well as the samples the medical examiner found in multiple areas of her body, were not. Multiple samples came back as matches for both Lamarcus and Latalvis, completely undermining both of their self-serving accounts. Simultaneously, a search of Vanessa's home led to the discovery of a journal entry dated January 9th, directly after the attacks, where she described the previous night as one of a kind, and even discussed how she'd had one hell of an adventure since being in the Big TN. Given her entire time in Tennessee had been spent with the gang, with most of it involving the torture and murder of Chris and Shannon, it was impossible for her to deny having not only been a participant in what happened, but to have found the whole sick and twisted ordeal enjoyable and exciting. On top of all of this, the bullets recovered from Chris's body were confirmed to match the .22 caliber revolver that was on Lamarcus at the time of his arrest. Ultimately, all four of them were indicted with multiple felony charges, as well as a host of charges for premeditated murder, especially aggravated robbery, kidnapping and assault. At the time, Eric was not thought to have been an active participant in the events, with no direct evidence tying him to the crimes, so instead, he was only arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact for his role in helping to conceal the murders and hide Lamarcus from the police. As the investigators and prosecutors began preparing for the 5 separate trials, the case was covered extensively by local news outlets, as well as by national media companies like the Associated Press and MSNBC. And as you can probably imagine, it began to garner an extreme reaction from the public. There were genuine questions and concerns around what motivated the group to carry out such horrific acts of cruelty and depravity. While their own stories were all inconsistent and contradictory, the 5 of them consistently agreed that the original intention had been to steal a vehicle, which could either be sold or used to sell drugs from. However, this in no way explained why they proceeded to torture, brutalize and murder Chris and Shannon in the manner that they did. Because the 5 suspects were all black and the 2 victims were white, there were discussions in the news and on the internet as to whether race was a factor in what happened, and whether hate crime charges should be pursued against them. Which, just to say, is a genuine discussion that needed to be had. In this instance, the motive offered by the killers didn't explain their actions, so debate needed to be had over what their true motives were. While it's a difficult conversation to have, it did need to be had. It's also worth saying, while their actions were undeniably filled with hate, that in itself does not constitute a hate crime. For hate crime charges to be pursued, there needed to be evidence that their actions were motivated by hate and prejudice. In this instance, if it could be determined they had targeted or brutalized the couple because they were white, it would be a hate crime. Despite the case receiving heavy local coverage in Tennessee, some online commenters began claiming that it was being ignored by the national media, accusing them of downplaying the story. Whether this was true or not, the idea was quickly weaponized by white supremacy groups. That's not to say that everyone who had questions or engaged in these debates was or is a white supremacist. Just that particular groups of extremists took advantage of the situation at the time, using people's genuine questions, fear and horror to try and promote their own agendas. The Nazi and Ku Klux Klan site Stormfront ran rampant with the story, garnering responses from its users stating things like, "We as white nationalists cannot allow the Jewish media bosses to simply slip this story down the media hole, and individuals of the white race are being sacrificed on the altar of political correctness." These Nazi websites also began publishing false and inflammatory information about the murders, including claims that Chris had been castrated and that Shannon's breasts had been chopped off and that she was also shot and set on fire. Despite these claims being completely made up, they quickly spread into mainstream discussions about the case, even making it onto some news reports. Supposedly, some of these claims originated from a Kentucky deputy U.S. Marshal, though what motivated him to make them up and spread them is unclear. As a result of all of this, groups of neo-Nazis began staging rallies and clashing with police in Knoxville, using the case to try and promote their own political agendas. This included a group led by Randy Gray of the Knights of the KKK, who brandished swastikas while carrying pictures of Chris and Shannon, alongside signs with slogans like "Diversity equals white death" and "Covered up by Jews." Some journalists who covered the case and argued there wasn't clear evidence to pursue hate crime charges were even doxxed, with prominent neo-Nazis encouraging people to track them down and harm them, even saying they'd be happy if they were murdered. The families of both victims condemned the rallies, wanting nothing to do with them, and accused the participants of twisting and weaponizing the murders of Chris and Shannon, saying their actions were dishonoring their memories and undermining the horror of what had actually happened to them. Commenting soon after, Shannon's father Gary stated, "There are people out there that just want to make something even worse than what it already is. I think any kind of crime like that's a hate crime. Was it racial? No, I don't think so." While the families were all clear in how disrespectful and insulting they found the rallies and the twisting of Chris and Shannon's deaths for political agendas to be, with Gary simply saying, "It ain't about you," they did actually have mixed feelings over whether the crime should be considered a hate crime or not. Chris's father Hugh, for instance, was quoted saying, "Would they have done that to a black couple? I don't think so." The Knoxville Chief of Police, Sterling Owen, also commented on the debate, saying that as it stood, there was no evidence to support the idea that the crime was race-based, and that it was currently being viewed as a cold-blooded murder. Knox County Sheriff Jimmy Jones also weighed in, saying, "I don't believe if they'd been Mexican, Chinese, or Japanese it would have mattered. I believe these people were evil. I believe it was a plan. These two kids just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." John Gill, special counsel to the Knox County District Attorney, also dismissed the notion of pursuing hate crime charges, stating, "This was a terrible, horrific crime, but race was not the motive. From our investigation, we know that the people charged in this case interacted with white people, had white friends, and even dated white people. There's no evidence of racial hostility, and in fact, there's evidence to the contrary." Ultimately, with no clear evidence to support claims of a racial motivation in the case, law enforcement, prosecutors, and the victims' families labelled the crimes as random and senseless. As for what justice would look like, Chris's mother Mary simply stated, "What is my hope? Well, I certainly hope that they are all convicted and all go to the death penalty, and even that is not enough justice for what they have done." The first trial began on April 16, 2008, for Eric Boyd, who claimed he didn't know about the murders until after they'd occurred. Regardless, he was found guilty of helping Lamaricus evade capture in the days following the crime, and he received an 18-year prison sentence. Due to the large number of motions filed by the defense attorneys for the 4 defendants facing murder charges, their trials all ended up taking more than 2 years to begin. Because of all the tension and controversy surrounding the case and the extensive media coverage in Knox County, Judge Richard Baumgartner, who was overseeing the 4 main trials, was forced to pull in jurors from areas such as Nashville who had to be kept sequestered throughout the entirety of the trials. Finally, on August 25, 2009, the trial for Latalvis Cobbins began. The prosecution described him as being the second-in-command behind his brother Lamaricus and presented forensic DNA evidence tying him to the assault of Shannon. Initially, his defense team tried to have the DNA evidence thrown out, though Judge Baumgartner obviously rejected their motion. Recorded phone calls Latalvis had made after his arrest were also played for the jury to hear, in which he discussed the damning DNA evidence against him and alluded to affiliations he had with gangs. Taking the stand in his own defense, Latalvis tried to claim that his semen was found on Shannon because he had engaged in consensual sex with her, which she did because he promised she would be let go as a result. Even if that was true, which it clearly wasn't, I'm not really sure what he thought it would change, because the scenario he described was clearly still not consensual and would still constitute assault. He even admitted that in his version of events, he didn't let her go afterwards like he'd supposedly promised her, and that he'd been present when she was left to die inside the trash bin. As you can guess, he was found guilty of the assault and first-degree murder of Shannon. But because of the lack of evidence tying him directly to the assault of Chris, he was acquitted on those charges and instead found guilty of the lesser charge of helping to facilitate Chris's murder. As a result, the jury sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, electing not to impose the death penalty in his case. The next to face trial was Lamaricus Davidson, who prosecutors argued was the mastermind behind everything that happened, presenting overwhelming evidence linking him to the crimes. His fingerprints were found in Shannon's SUV, as well as on the trash bags she was left in, and on her various personal belongings. His semen was recovered from multiple parts of her body, as well as her clothing, and he had even been holding the gun used to kill Chris when he was arrested. The other evidence presented was so graphic that it led multiple people in the courtroom to faint, including one of the prosecutors. This included large photographs and detailed expert testimony describing precisely what had been done to the victims and the extensive injuries they had sustained. Similar to his brother, Lamaricus and his defense team tried to argue that Shannon had consensual sex with him, but they took it one step further by claiming that she and Chris had willingly come to the Chipman Street house that day to buy drugs from him. To counter this claim, the prosecution called witnesses and presented evidence supporting the characters of Shannon and Chris, and showed toxicology reports showing no traces of drugs in Shannon's system, and only minimal traces of marijuana in Chris's system, indicating occasional use. Lamaricus's team then argued that because his semen was found on the inside crotch of Shannon's jeans, it meant that she must have been a willing participant in the sex acts, as she'd been able to put them back on afterwards, which they claimed wouldn't have happened if she hadn't been in control of the situation. In response, the prosecution presented more detailed evidence of the brutal injuries Shannon had sustained from the repeated assaults, making it clear that no one would willingly have endured such violence. So the defense then argued that it was only when George and Latalvis arrived at the house that things went wrong. In their account, Lamaricus had consensual sex with Shannon, but George and Latalvis arrived and began assaulting the couple, causing their injuries. Once again, this was an entirely different story to the 5 or 6 versions of events he had already recounted to the investigators. In the end, the jury found him guilty of 35 out of the 38 charges put against him, including the first-degree murder of both Chris and Shannon, and only took a couple of hours to decide his fate. On October 28th, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Speaking at his sentencing, Judge Baumgartner called it one of the most incredibly outrageous, cruel, and inhumane cases this court has ever seen. Before going on to say, there really is no sentence great enough to punish you for the conduct you have been convicted of. The third murder trial was for George Thomas, who admitted to being present in the house during the crimes, but denied participating in any of the assaults or murders. His defense team argued that there was no fingerprint or DNA evidence linking him to the crimes, and that none of the other defendants had made statements placing him in an active role. Regardless, the circumstantial evidence was enough to convict him on all 38 charges against him, and on December 10th, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The final trial for Vanessa Coleman proved to be the toughest for the prosecutors. While she admitted to being in the house, she claimed she was too frightened to intervene and that she'd been threatened by the others and feared for her own life. She'd also been granted immunity from the carjacking charges in exchange for her testimony in the other 3 murder cases, which meant that she could only be charged in connection to the assaults and murders, and there was no actual physical evidence directly tying her to those crimes. That said, her diary entry did strongly imply she'd been a willing participant in the events and that she'd found it all exciting and enjoyable, undermining her claims. Ultimately, she was acquitted of the most serious charges against her, but was found guilty of facilitating the assault and murder of Shannon. On July 30, 2010, she was given a 53-year prison sentence, with Judge Baumgartner ignoring her pleas for leniency. The family members of Chris and Shannon were present throughout all of the court proceedings, forced to listen to the harrowing details about everything that had been done to them. Extra security was provided during the trials, with specialized teams and metal detectors placed at the courtrooms due to the controversy surrounding the cases and the intense media coverage, which included live broadcasts. However, although all of the defendants had been convicted and were behind bars, this horrific case was far from over. Because something was about to happen that would open up a whole new world of controversy and undermine all the sentences that had just been handed out. With Lamarcus on death row and the others all serving their various prison sentences, it finally seemed like things were coming to a close on the case. But then, in 2011, Judge Baumgartner abruptly announced he was stepping away for medical reasons. That decision was soon followed by a much bigger revelation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had uncovered evidence that Judge Baumgartner had been illegally purchasing prescription painkillers from a convicted felon, Christopher Lee Gibson, who had appeared before him in court. Additionally, he was accused by a woman of exchanging legal favors for sex during court breaks. In fact, this investigation had been going on for a while, and brought attention to a moment in the 2010 verdict reading for Vanessa's trial, when he stumbled through his official statement, struggling to read it. By March of 2011, the judge entered a guilty plea to a felony charge of official misconduct. He was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison and disbarred. With his conviction sending shockwaves through the legal community, it triggered a sweeping review of all of the cases he had been involved with, including all 4 of the Knoxville Horror murder trials. As a result, on December 1st, Judge John Kerry Blackwood ruled that all 4 cases had been compromised by his misconduct, with Judge Baumgartner using opiates while presiding over all of the trials, granting all 4 of them retrials. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court then stepped in and overruled Judge Blackwood, stating that Judge Baumgartner's misconduct didn't automatically justify new trials unless it could be shown that it directly affected the proceedings. But despite this ruling, Judge Blackwood still granted all 4 of them retrials. This led to a constant back and forth between him and the prosecution and victims' families, who all wanted him to step down from the case, accusing him of having an ulterior motive for wanting to be involved in the highly publicized trials. This eventually resulted in him also being removed from the case, and led to Senior Judge Walter Kurtz being appointed to oversee the retrials instead. Despite the various appeals from all 4 of the defendants, Judge Kurtz ultimately ruled that there was so much solid forensic evidence linking Lamarcus and Letalvis to the crimes that there was no point giving them retrials, meaning their original sentences were upheld. George and Vanessa, on the other hand, were both granted new trials because of Baumgartner's misconduct. In her second trial in 2012, Vanessa was once again found guilty, though of slightly lesser charges, resulting in her sentence being reduced from 53 to 35 years in prison. This included time already served and made her eligible for parole. All of her attempts to appeal the verdict and receive a third trial were then rejected. At his retrial, George was also found guilty once again, with Judge Kurtz sentencing him to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus an additional 25 years to be served concurrently. At his sentencing, Shannon's father Gary addressed him directly, telling him, "You taught me how to hate." Like Vanessa, he submitted multiple appeals, but his verdict was upheld, with the Supreme Court declining to even hear his case. Lamarcus, meanwhile, was given a further 8 years on top of his existing sentence after pleading guilty for a separate robbery at a Knoxville Pizza Hut, committed the day after the murders took place. In 2013, the parents of both Chris and Shannon appeared on Glenn Beck's online show to discuss the case. During the conversation, Glenn suggested that it should have been treated as a hate crime, even though Tennessee law didn't support that charge. In response, Shannon's mother Dina simply stated, "Who cares what color you are? I care what they did to my child." As a result of the retrials, testimony emerged that implied that Eric had potentially been more involved in the crimes than the prosecution had previously been able to prove, with both George and Letalvis accusing him of shooting Chris and being directly involved in kidnapping the couple. This caused the investigators to begin re-examining evidence, leading to the discovery of his fingerprints on a holster found under a car seat. They also found multiple witnesses who told them they saw 4 men with the SUV on the night of the murders, as well as others who claimed Eric had made a variety of incriminating statements while hiding out with Lamarcus. In exchange for testifying against him, the prosecution offered George the chance to have his sentence reduced to 50 years, which he accepted. So in 2019, More than a decade after the murders, Eric faced a new trial in Knox County, facing 36 charges, including first-degree felony murder and aggravated assault, meaning he could finally be held accountable for his role in the murders. After hearing the various witness testimonies, including George's account of Eric's actions that night, a jury found Eric guilty of all charges and sentenced him to life in prison, plus an additional 90 years. As with the other defendants, Eric attempted to appeal the sentence, but his conviction was upheld, with the Supreme Court rejecting his final appeal in 2022. The relief in the courtroom when Eric was found guilty was palpable, as it marked the end of a long and agonizing journey for the loved ones of Chris and Shannon. After hearing the verdict, Chris's mother Mary, who had long pushed for Eric to be charged for the murders, was quoted saying, "I've always had a mother's instinct that he was the one who murdered my son." Shannon's father, Gary, also gave his thoughts on the new verdict, saying, "We'll never get justice on this earth, not for what they did, but I think we got them all, and that's what I promised my daughter." As of today, George, Latalvis, and Eric are all still serving their prison sentences, while Lamaricus is yet to be executed and is currently sitting on death row at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Although Vanessa became eligible for parole in 2020, she was denied it and remains incarcerated. Both the mothers of Chris and Shannon spoke out against her at the parole board hearing, who set her next review date for 2030. The house on Chipman Street where the murders occurred was later demolished, with a memorial being erected in its place to honor the couple. Both Chris and Shannon had multiple foundations created in their names, including the Shannon Gale Christian Foundation, which awards an annual scholarship to a female student attending the University of Tennessee where Shannon studied, and an annual baseball scholarship provided by Chris's former high school. Shannon was laid to rest at the Berry Highland West Memorial Park in Knoxville, while Chris was buried at Woodhaven Memorial Gardens in Claxton, Anderson County. New laws were also enacted in memory of both Shannon and Chris. The Shannon Christian Act was introduced to prevent future situations in court, where a defendant and their team could make unsubstantiated, harmful, or inappropriate comments about a victim with the intent of tarnishing their character, including disclosing private aspects of their past, such as mental health struggles or substance abuse. This was in direct response to Lamaricus's attempts to claim the couple had come to his home to buy drugs, with no evidence to back up his statements, while the jury hadn't even been allowed to hear about his own past convictions. The Chris Newsom Act, on the other hand, changed the guidelines for judges acting as the 13th juror in criminal trials, meaning they could not override the jury's decision regarding a defendant's fate. This was in response to the controversy regarding Judge Baumgartner, whose actions had led to questions about the fairness of the original trials and sentences. Even after all these years, the horror of what happened still lingers in Knoxville. The names Shannon Christian and Chris Newsom are now etched into the city's memory. The people still remember, the families still grieve, and for anyone who hears their story, it becomes part of theirs too, because this is the sort of story that stays with you forever. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some things should never be forgotten. And with that, our deep dive into this very disturbing and uncomfortable case comes to a close. As regular viewers will likely realise, this video is a remake of one of my older cases, using my own voice alongside an updated video to match the quality of my current stuff. But the script I've used is essentially the same as the original video, and as I said at the time, it was a particularly harrowing and unpleasant case to research and write about. But I do think it's important to keep telling Shannon and Chris's stories, and not to forget what happened to them, or the people responsible. I also think it's important not to sanitize stories like this, so I've tried to tell the case in as much detail as possible, while creating a video that can still actually exist on here and get seen. Just to cut in with a little recorded aside here, for some reason, as I've been editing all this audio together and making the new video, the original seems to have randomly gained a burst of life out of nowhere. Sort of makes it seem like it's probably not the best one to have redone right now, but it's a little too late to do anything about it. Anyway, back to the real sign-off. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all those things that help YouTube know it's worth pushing out, rather than hiding it in a corner somewhere. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. September 3rd, 1986. After spending an evening testing out a couple of rifles with their friends, Doug and Chris Wells arrive back at their house on Parker Court in Missoula, Montana. But as they approach, they notice an orange and white Ford pickup parked awkwardly across their front lawn, half on the street, half on the grass. Grabbing a flashlight, Doug shines it into the truck, spotting a man slumped over the driver's seat who seems to shift slightly from the light, but he just looks like he's passed out. So thinking the driver probably just had too much to drink, he joins his wife in the house. As Chris gets ready for bed, Doug, a gunsmith by trade, heads down to the basement, wanting to clean up one of the old Savage model rifles he had been testing out earlier that night before he goes to sleep. Once he's finished, he leaves the gun resting on his reloading bench beside 6 untouched cartridges. But just as he's about to head upstairs to bed with Chris, he pauses. He can't shake the sense that something's off about the truck parked outside. So he heads back out, planning to take down the license plate and call the cops. But when he opens his front door, the truck has vanished. With no choice but to shrug it off, Doug suddenly remembers he hasn't taken the garbage out yet, and tomorrow is trash day. But as he pulls the bins out of his garage, something catches in the corner of his eye. Movement. A man hidden in the shadows, crouching behind an ornamental evergreen to the side of his house. Panicked, Doug calls out, asking who's there. In response, the man jumps out into the open, announcing himself as Wayne from Conlin's. Despite having met him before, Doug doesn't immediately recognize Wayne as someone who works for his wife at Conlin's Furniture. If he had, his reaction might have been very different. Because Wayne had actually been harassing his wife for months at this point, having become disturbingly obsessed with her. Instead, Doug questions what the hell he's doing in the bushes, and when Wayne tells him that he'd seen somebody out here acting strangely, Doug's mind immediately thinks of the suspicious truck from earlier, instead of how suspicious Wayne's presence at his house is. Assuming he must have been driving by and seen something, when Wayne tells him to hurry inside and grab a flashlight so they can check it out together, Doug doesn't think twice about it. But as Doug steps into his garage and heads up the stairs to his house, something suddenly strikes him hard. Doug collapses into his living room, blood pouring from a deep wound in the back of his head. As he turns himself over, he sees Wayne moving up the steps towards him, his eyes cold and empty, holding a heavy-looking black baton. His instincts taking over, Doug manages to boot Wayne in the leg hard enough that he stumbles back into a wall before he can hit him again. And as Wayne tries to stand, Doug launches himself at him. Struggling desperately, the two men crash around the living room, knocking furniture over and slamming into walls. Hearing the commotion, Chris rushes down to see what's happening, finding her husband bleeding badly from the back of the head as he fights with the intruder. But then, Wayne suddenly pulls out a black Ruger, aiming it at Doug and ordering him to move back. Reluctantly, Doug does as he's told, releasing Wayne and shifting towards his wife, who is staring at the intruder with confusion, because she instantly recognizes him. But as she tries to reason with her employee and ask why he's doing this, Wayne waves the gun in her face, shutting her down. He tells her that he's done something really terrible and needs to get out of town. He knows Conlin's got paid today, so he's certain she has money in the house. Then, Wayne pulls out a plastic bag he's hidden beneath his shirt, removing a length of white clothesline rope from it, which he cuts with a kitchen knife from his belt. He tosses the rope over to Chris, ordering her to tie up her husband. Chris tries to assure him that it isn't necessary, but he ignores her. And with how cold and calculated he now looks, she silently accepts that she has no choice but to obey him. So she ties Doug's hands and feet, with Wayne ordering her to pull the binds tighter and tighter. She then leads him to the money they have in the house, including showing him where her purse is. All the while, she tries to question him about what it is he's supposedly done, not yet realizing the gravity of the situation she's in. She doesn't even consider the idea that Wayne might have any intention other than robbing them. Not yet anyway. After searching through the house and closing all of the blinds, Wayne then ties Chris up as well, despite Doug's protests. He tells them that he'll call someone when he's gone to come and untie them, even getting them to give him the phone number of a friend, which he writes down on a note. However, through all of this, it starts to become clear to Doug that Wayne is not in a rush as he'd claimed. He doesn't even seem panicked. He seems calm and rational, like he knows exactly what he's doing. And then Wayne tells them that he's going to separate them so they can't help untie each other when he leaves. With Doug unable to do anything, Wayne carries Chris out of the room, down the hall, and into the bedroom. There, he uses more rope to tie her wrists and ankles to the bed, stuffing a makeshift gag in her mouth. With Chris secured, he returns to Doug and stuffs a sock into his mouth. Even though Doug instantly realizes he can just spit it out, he doesn't, thinking he should play along with Wayne, who is looking more unhinged by the minute. Then, Wayne takes Doug to the basement, helping him down the stairs and over to a post he can tie him to. But as he tries to tie him up, Doug slips down to the floor, bleeding badly from his head wound and struggling to stand. In anger, Wayne hits him with the baton, over and over again. Doug manages to scramble back, pleading with him to leave now he has the money, but instead, Wayne pulls his gun back out and tells him to move back to the post and to stay still this time, or he'll shoot him. Finally realizing that both he and Chris are in real danger, Doug has no choice but to let Wayne loop rope around his neck, armpits and shoulders, anchoring him to the post. When he's done, he heads up the stairs and slams the door shut behind him. And alone in the room, Doug's eyes immediately shift to the old rifle resting on his reloading bench. Upstairs, Chris tries desperately to loosen her binds, making slow but steady progress, knowing that she could get to the phone and call for help if she could just undo them. But before she gets a chance, Wayne returns, and without saying a word, he circles around her like a predator studying its prey. Confident her binds are still in place, he leaves the room again, returning to Doug to do the same thing. He continues moving back and forth between the two rooms for half an hour, with the couple both trying to free themselves every time he leaves them alone. But Doug's consciousness is fading fast, with an enormous amount of blood spilling from his head. And when his eyes open to see Wayne yet again, he suddenly feels a sharp blow to his chest. He looks down to see a knife piercing his body. He sucks in air as Wayne withdraws the blade, casually wiping away the blood on Doug's pants. This was his plan all along, to eliminate Doug and have Chris all to himself. So he heads up the stairs for the final time, leaving Doug alone to bleed out in the basement. Slumping down, Doug can feel his life fading away. But something inside of him refuses to give up, refuses to let Wayne do the same thing to his wife. And so he somehow finds the strength to stay awake, to force himself up, and to continue working to escape his binds. Eventually, he manages to loosen the ropes around his body and neck, just enough to slip one of his hands free, and with a desperate tug, he's able to pull the last knot and move his hands away from the post. Barely able to stand, Doug staggers over to the reloading bench and grabs the old rifle, but his hands are trembling so much that he can barely hold it, let alone load one of the cartridges into the chamber. Against all odds, he manages to load the gun, clamber up the basement stairs, and emerge back in the hallway. Knowing Wayne will return if he makes any noise, he hides himself in the shadows, aims the rifle at the top of the stairs, and kicks the wall as loudly as he can. Wayne appears just as he'd expected. He begins moving down the stairs when he suddenly spots Doug in the darkness, bloody and battered, and pointing the rifle at him. Doug sees a split second of fear flash across Wayne's face before he charges towards him. But Doug does not hesitate. The bullet hits Wayne in the side, causing him to stumble before scrambling back out of sight. Doug forces himself up the stairs after him with the now unloaded rifle, where he finds Wayne on his hands and knees, trying to stand. So he strikes Wayne on the back of the head and neck with the rifle until he collapses to the floor. But Wayne is still alive, crawling forward, down the hallway. So Doug continues to whack him with the gun with everything he's got. Finally, as they reach the bedroom door, the rifle's wooden stock shatters on Wayne's head, splinters flying everywhere. Wayne then rolls onto his back, pleading desperately for him to stop as he crawls into a corner of the bedroom, just as Chris frees herself from her binds too. As Chris sees the state of her husband, she begins punching Wayne in anger and fear, getting in Doug's way. But Doug can see Wayne reaching for his own gun. So he shoves Chris back onto the bed and swings with what's left of the rifle, hitting the gun just as Wayne fires, sending the bullet into the ceiling. With Wayne continuing to pull his trigger, Doug hits him relentlessly to try and stop him, not even stopping when one of the bullets tears through his leg. The lamp beside them falls and shatters, plunging them into darkness, the only light now coming from Wayne's gunshots. But Doug knows there's a handgun in one of the bedroom drawers, so he clambers over to it in the darkness and pulls it out. He then flicks on the main light, planning to catch Wayne off guard and shoot him. But then he stops. Wayne is wheezing and his eyes are rolled back, having accidentally shot himself in the head with his own gun during the chaos. Chris kicks his gun away from his hand as Doug lies down on the bed, knowing that he's managed to save his wife, but not himself. At least that's what he thinks. But he's wrong. Despite his serious injuries, after hours on the operating table, Doug is able to pull through and make a full recovery. Wayne, on the other hand, is not so lucky. But Wayne Nance was not just any old home invader. While Doug believed he had just killed an intruder in self-defense, he had, in reality, just ended the reign of terror of one of the nation's most vicious, unknown serial killers. Because after Wayne's death, evidence found in his house and later revelations would confirm that between 1974 and 1986, he had already murdered at least 6 other people before attacking Chris and Doug that night. With his crimes only being connected to him after his death, the true number of Wayne's victims are unknown, and nowadays he is better known as Born on October 18, 1955, Wayne Nance grew up in a working-class trailer park just outside of Missoula, alongside his 4 siblings. His father, George, was a truck driver who was rarely home, and his mother, Charlene, was a part-time waitress who struggled with alcoholism. Wayne was bright and articulate, but even his mother noticed he was strange from an early age. He was obsessed with learning about adult things like sex long before he should have had any interest in the topics, and he seemed to enjoy scaring and creeping out the other children. Even as a young child, he constantly sketched creepy images of warped and distorted faces, demonic creatures, and violent, blood-drenched scenes. He was always an outsider, who didn't seem to care what anyone thought about him or how his actions impacted others. But most concerning of all, he had an extremely volatile and fractious temper. The smallest things would set him off, like a glance at him that he didn't like, and be met with physical violence, meaning he regularly got into fights with other boys. Several people reported his behavior to his parents, including the owners of the trailer park, Elmer and Marge Frame, who told them Wayne seemed to find pleasure causing harm and distress to others. But George always dismissed their worries, shrugging off his son's actions with remarks such as, "Boys will be boys," and rarely disciplining him. At one point, Elmer even witnessed Wayne approach an incinerator on the trailer park before pouring a box of kittens into it and switching it on. According to Elmer, Wayne then stood listening to the animals screaming, looking completely unfazed by it. In 1968, when Wayne was 13 years old, his father, George, was arrested for armed robbery and assault. George had held up a local store at gunpoint, tying up the assistant manager and beating him with a pistol, which led to him receiving a 5-year prison sentence. And now looking after Wayne and his 4 siblings alone, Charlene found it even more difficult to keep him in check. While she wanted to send him to a reform school, she just didn't have the money to do it. Despite his growing reputation at school for terrorizing his classmates, Wayne was still an exceptional student who impressed his teachers with his grades and academic ability. They tried to encourage his love for reading, hoping it would help move him away from his troubling behavior. But Wayne only grew increasingly odd. He made friends with other kids who were outsiders, and most people just assumed he was an eccentric weirdo, like the rest of them. But while a lot of teens at the time showed an interest in things like occultism and Satanism, Wayne was fixated on them. He read and researched everything he could and talked constantly about demons, spirits, and dark gods. Even when he began carrying knives with him to school and making claims about various disturbing things he'd done, such as torturing animals with them, most of his peers and friends still believed him to be harmless. In their eyes, it was all just talk, a character Wayne was pretending to be. That is, until one day he brought a syringe into school that he claimed he found on the street, bragging that he was going to stab someone with it. His friends assumed he was just bluffing and messing around. But then, he suddenly ran up to a random student and thrust the syringe into their leg, before laughing hysterically and running off. And by the time he was 18, something had started to change in the way he acted, and it became increasingly difficult to tell whether he was just playing a part, as everyone had always thought, or if he truly meant the things he was saying. He started confiding in his friends that a dark queen had been visiting him in his dreams and telling him that he needed to make a human sacrifice before his 19th birthday in order to obtain the title Ordained Warlock. Unable to tell if he was serious or not anymore, his friends tried to talk him out of taking his dreams literally. But Wayne refused to listen to them, telling them that he had to do what the Dark Queen demanded, or there'd be consequences, and his birthday was fast approaching, meaning he was almost out of time to complete his task. On April 11, 1974, authorities believe Wayne targeted his first known victim at the age of 18. Instead of choosing somebody random to sacrifice to his Dark Queen, he selected a victim he was familiar with, the mother of one of his schoolmates, Donna Pounds. Wayne had visited the Pounds house many times and was well acquainted with the family's routine and schedule. He also knew the family was selling their home, which meant they often left the front door unlocked for the realtor. He even knew where Donna's husband, Harvey, kept his gun. It's also worth mentioning, given Wayne's satanic beliefs, that the Pounds were an extremely religious family. They were active members of the Bethel Baptist Church, where Harvey served as a deacon. Harvey was particularly devout and was preparing to lead a new congregation, which prompted the sale of their house. He even hosted a radio show that preached against the dangers of Satanism, which he believed was on the rise. That afternoon, when Donna returned to her empty house at around 1:30 p.m., she was confronted by Wayne standing in her master bedroom, holding her husband's .22 caliber pistol, having slipped into the house through the unlocked front door. Before she could even try and plead with him, he fired a warning shot, silencing her. He then ordered her onto the bed and tied her wrists and ankles to the posts with pieces of white rope he'd brought with him in a black gym bag. He then cut away her clothes with a knife and proceeded to assault her. Afterwards, he untied her and forced her down into the basement, bringing her to a small furnace room beneath the stairs. There, he tied her back up, taped her mouth shut and stood behind her. He then fired 5 shots into the back of her head at point-blank range. As a final act of violation, he inserted the gun inside of her, leaving it there. Then he turned off the lights, climbed the stairs, and left. When Harvey arrived home, one of his daughters was watching TV with a friend, unaware her mother's dead body was down in the basement beneath them. She told him there were ropes on the bed upstairs for some reason, which he immediately went to investigate. In the bedroom, he found the ropes as well as clear signs that something terrible had happened: Donna's ripped clothes and his empty gun holster. Trying not to panic them, he convinced his daughter and her friend to go over to her place. Once he was alone, he continued looking through the house, trying to figure out what had happened and where his wife was, both of which were answered when he entered the basement and found her dead body still on her knees by the furnace. He immediately called the police, who rushed to the scene, with detectives later stating it was one of the most vicious crimes the area had ever seen. Although the detectives tried to keep the severity of the crime hidden to avoid causing mass panic in the small, tight-knit community, rumours quickly circulated about what had happened. And one such rumour was started by Wayne himself. Because the next day at school, Wayne sat next to his close friend Bill Van Canagan on the gym bleachers and coldly told him, "It's done." Then Wayne pulled up his sleeve, revealing a crude, bloodied pentagram he had carved into his forearm. Bill knew exactly what he was referring to. He knew in that moment that Wayne had made his sacrifice to the Dark Queen and that he had murdered Donna Pounds. But he didn't know what to do with the information, especially given Wayne had started making thinly veiled threats to harm him if he told anyone. He worried that if he went to the police, Wayne would find out, and he would murder him next. Wayne, after all, knew everything about him. He was one of his closest friends, or at least he had been. So Bill chose to take his information to their school principal instead, Don Harbaugh. Although Principal Harbaugh took him seriously, he also pointed out that he had no evidence Wayne had killed Donna, and that if he was wrong, accusing him of murder on the basis of his strange behaviour would ruin his life. Ultimately, he told Bill that unless he was willing to talk to the sheriff's department himself, there wasn't much he could do to help him. Surprisingly, Bill did actually find the courage to go directly to the police. And although the information he offered them gave them nothing concrete to arrest Wayne with, it turned out they had actually already been looking in his direction. Detectives had initially suspected Harvey Pounds of killing his own wife, especially as he had no alibi, and they had learnt he had been having an inappropriate relationship with another woman, giving him a motive. However, a number of witnesses came forward saying they had seen Wayne near the Pounds house on the day of the murder, with others describing someone who matched his build, carrying a black gym bag through the field behind the house. It also turned out he had skipped school that day, and nobody knew where he had been. And finally, a blood-stained latex glove was discovered on the road towards the trailer park he lived in, which had been sent off to an FBI lab for analysis. So armed with all this information, deputies went to Wayne's home in the trailer park while he was at school, where his mother, Charlene, let them in after they showed her a search warrant. Among the searchers was Deputy Larry Weatherman, whose career would in many ways be defined by this case. He had been the one who had found the latex glove, and once inside Wayne's room in the trailer, he was determined to find its missing partner. Deputy Weatherman was shocked at how neat and orderly Wayne's room was. He didn't find the glove, but he did locate a black gym bag that matched the one witnesses had seen someone carrying. And when he opened the bag, he discovered a range of bullets and shell casings inside, some of which happened to be the same brand as the ones used in the murder. The deputies even managed to locate a pair of Wayne's underwear in one of his drawers that had a dark stain on it that looked like blood, which Charlene told them she had only just washed and wasn't able to get the discoloration out. With all this evidence, they brought Wayne in for questioning. But when they spoke to him, he was calm and articulate and answered every question with ease. He told them he had been at home working on a class project that day, that the glove had nothing to do with him, that the shell casings and bullets were just random ones he had collected. He even willingly took a polygraph test for them, which he passed with ease. And given this was the early 1970s, when polygraph tests were much more widely accepted as reliable, this seemed to suggest that Wayne was telling the truth to them. By contrast, Harvey Pounds' polygraph test came back inconclusive, muddying the water even more. But what detectives didn't know at the time was that Wayne had done his homework on polygraphs, learning exactly what they measured and how they could be deceived. This included an in-depth discussion with lawyer Ronald McDonald about them while he was considering representing Wayne, though he ultimately declined to be his lawyer, finding his presence too unsettling. When the results came back from the underwear found in Wayne's bedroom, they confirmed that the stain was human blood, but the sample had been scrubbed too well to be able to confirm who it belonged to. Similarly, none of the bullets found in the gym bag were an exact match for the ones used in the murder. So with no solid evidence connecting him to the case, they were never able to formally charge Wayne for killing Donna Pounds, and instead focused their attention on Harvey, who at the time was seen as a more viable suspect. and before long, the investigation stalled and the case began to turn cold. But Deputy Weatherman never forgot about Wayne and never stopped believing he had murdered Donna Pounds. 2 months after Donna's murder, Wayne graduated high school and joined the Navy, moving to San Diego to begin his training. And just like that, he was gone, off to see the world, and out of Missoula. He didn't even stick around to greet his father when he was released from prison. For some reason, Wayne appeared to lose all interest in Satanism and the occult around this time. His obsession, his apparent motive for needing to murder Donna, being dropped as if it had never meant anything to him, as if it was just a typical teenage phase he'd grown out of. After completing his training, Wayne became an electrician aboard the USS Robertson, where he gained a reputation as an excellent, hard-working member of the crew. But everything changed in 1976, when he received a subpoena to appear before a grand jury in Missoula. Since the murder of Donna, several more murders had occurred in the county of Missoula, with none of them being solved. And this had led to a growing paranoia that a satanic cult was operating in the area. Though this rumor likely originated with Wayne's ties to Satanism and the occult, it put immense pressure on the authorities to try to solve some of these murders. And as a result, a grand jury was assembled to review the case of Donna Pounds. In total, more than 100 witnesses were called to testify, including Bill and various friends and classmates of Wayne, who told the jury about the things Wayne had said and done both before and after Donna's murder. However, Wayne himself seemed cold and disinterested throughout proceedings, denying any involvement and answering every question put to him with ease. In the end, despite the authorities proving his school project alibi had been a lie, the grand jury, just like the original detectives, did not find enough evidence to indict him, and Wayne was sent back to San Diego. But in San Diego, back aboard the USS Robertson, something changed in Wayne. He seemed unsettled by what had happened, and his mindset was suddenly completely different. Where before his record had been spotless, over the next year he faced numerous disciplinary fines and rank reductions for being caught with various illegal substances, such as LSD, stolen property, and illegal butterfly knives. And by 1977, he had been discharged for misconduct, ending his military career at the age of 22. Forced to return to Missoula, Wayne struggled to blend back into the community, given many people still suspected him of both murdering Donna and being part of a satanic cult. This led to him briefly heading over to Seattle in 1978, where it's now believed he claimed his next victim. Because not long after Wayne arrived in the area, a 15-year-old runaway called Devonna Nelson disappeared. It's believed that Wayne likely encountered her while she was hitchhiking out of Seattle, offering her a ride. Then, near the Beavertail State Park in Missoula, he assaulted her and stabbed her to death, before discarding her body near a train track. Her body wasn't found until February 27, 1980, when the crew of a freight train stumbled across it, lying against a chain-link fence near the tracks. Having been exposed to the elements for a year and a half, her body was so decomposed it was impossible to identify her. She had no shoes or underwear, and her dress had been pulled up around her neck. At the time, she became known as Betty Beavertail, a nickname Deputy Weatherman gave her due to her proximity to the Beavertail State Park. It wasn't until 1985 that she was formally identified as the runaway girl from Seattle. Although no direct evidence has been found linking Wayne to her death, authorities strongly suspect he is responsible. But at the time, nobody knew he had even been in Seattle, and he wasn't on anyone's radar as a suspect. Then, on April 4, 1980, Wayne's mother Charlene died in a car accident. She had been working at a roadside bar called The Cabin and had gotten into an argument with her husband George, who had accused her of being drunk. After speeding off in her car, she crashed into a tree while driving along Deer Creek Road. There were no skid marks found, and no signs she attempted to brake. And as a result, authorities believed she had done it intentionally. Only a month after she was buried, George's father also passed away, leaving him a small home on Minnesota Avenue, a short walk away from the cabin. So the family, including Wayne, relocated to the house. Wayne had enrolled in courses at the University of Montana and was doing surprisingly well until his mother's death, after which he began failing all of his classes and eventually dropped out. Instead, he found work as a security guard at the cabin. And Wayne was good at the job, always ready to step in but never looking for a fight. In fact, he'd warned his fellow bouncers that he might lose control if things got physical, so he usually hung back while they did the talking. Wayne seemed to finally find his place back in society, building close friendships with other employees who knew nothing about his past, and nothing about the disturbing things he continued to do behind closed doors. Everyone at the cabin saw him as charming and kind-hearted, and he seemed to go out of his way to be helpful, doing things like scraping ice off his co-workers' windshields during winter just to be nice. He was the last person any of them would have suspected of being a violent predator. In one instance, in the summer of 1981, Wayne focused his attention on a woman called Doris Schmidt. Doris had recently moved into a one-bedroom apartment in East Missoula after separating from her husband, Bill. Having watched her since she'd moved in, Wayne knew that she lived alone and would be an easy target. But what he didn't know was that on the very night he chose to attack her, she had allowed Bill to stay over to help comfort him over his father's battle with a terminal illness. Wayne slipped into the apartment at night and crept towards the bedroom. But when he opened the door, he was confronted by an angry Bill who ordered him to get out immediately. Wayne pretended he was drunk and confused and stumbled out of the room, closing the door behind him. But Wayne didn't actually leave. Clearly deciding his next moves, Doris heard him still moving around in the next room. So this time when Bill went out to confront him, he was forced to physically throw him out of the apartment. But the next morning, Doris and Bill woke to find Wayne asleep outside their window. He told them that he'd gotten drunk and wandered into the wrong apartment, so they didn't call the police or press charges. Only years later, when Doris discovered who Wayne truly was, did she realise just how lucky she'd been that Bill had come to stay with her that night. Rather than being put off by this experience, Wayne realised that he needed to be more cautious moving forward and to be far better prepared before his next attack. Around the same time, he began working part-time at Conlin's furniture store in Missoula, working as a delivery driver, and this gave him the perfect means of scouting for victims. The job gave him direct access into people's homes as he delivered furniture to them, allowing him to see the layout of their houses and get a sense of how many people lived there. He was literally being welcomed inside by them. Everyone at Conlin's saw him as soft-spoken and polite. But underneath the politeness, Wayne was building something. He began sketching maps and floor plans of homes that he delivered to, marking down ways to get inside and ways to make a quick escape. The maps were detailed and thorough, and on April 27, 1983, that planning turned into action. That night, as soon as Janet Wicker opened the door to her townhouse at the cobblestone apartments in Hellgate Canyon, a man sprang from the shadows and grabbed her. Wayne had previously delivered furniture to her apartment, and a detailed drawing of her home would later be found among his belongings, making it safe to assume he was her attacker. When she screamed, he punched her in the face, knocking her to the floor. She continued fighting back until he pulled a knife and threatened her with it, telling her he only wanted money, just like he would later do with Chris and Doug Wells. He then demanded that she take him to the bedroom, with Janet knowing exactly what his intentions were, but unable to do anything to stop him. But just as they reached the stairs, the front door opened as her husband arrived home earlier than expected. Wayne then pushed her aside and bolted through the apartment, jumping out of the second-floor balcony window and vanishing into the night. Having not seen his face, there was little Janet could provide the police to help identify her attacker. And once again, nobody was looking at Wayne, even though his violent and predatory behaviour was escalating week by week. Interestingly, around the time Wayne started working at Conlin's, his boss, Chris Wells, discovered somebody had snuck into her house and poured blood on her wedding dress before putting it back into her cupboard. She never found out who had done it, why they had done it, or when they had done it. But given everything that unfolded later, it seems likely that Wayne was responsible, and that it was a sign of his growing obsession with her that would ultimately lead to his own death. In August of 1984, a 16-year-old runaway calling herself Robin was hitching a ride with a trucker. But after getting into an argument with him, he kicked her out of his vehicle close to the cabin bar. Unsure what to do next, she entered the bar, striking up a conversation with Wayne as he worked as a bouncer at the doors. She told him what had happened, explaining that she didn't have any money. So putting on the charming and friendly persona he had perfected, Wayne offered to buy her a drink and began chatting with her. After telling him she had nowhere to stay, Wayne invited her to crash at his place for a bit, until she figured out what she was going to do next. Feeling an instant connection with him, she happily agreed to his offer. Even his father, George, seemed to accept her in the house, offering her money to do various chores for him. Wayne's co-workers, particularly a woman called Julie Slocum, who happened to have a crush on him, all found the dynamic between the two strange. Wayne didn't usually speak much about his private life, but now he was bragging about his sex life with Robin and telling everyone how infatuated with her he was. But around a month after she'd shown up at the bar, Robin suddenly vanished. The last time anyone saw her was at a birthday party for Julie, and when Julie and Wayne's other co-workers asked about her whereabouts, Wayne simply stated, "She's gone," which they all just assumed meant the two had broken up and that Robin had moved on, hitchhiking somewhere new. Though Julie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about it all, and she was right. Robin hadn't just gotten on a bus or in a truck and left town. She was dead. Trusting Wayne completely, she had happily accepted his invitation for a walk in the woods, likely expecting a romantic outing. Instead, Wayne led her to a shallow grave near the Bonner Dam. While it's unknown exactly what happened next, what is known is that he shot her in the back of the head, then twice more in the temple. She was left face up and naked in the grave. But unlike his previous murders and attacks, Robin's death seemed to deeply affect him, and he became noticeably withdrawn and irritable afterwards. Eventually, this led to the breakdown of his friendships with the other staff at the bar, including Julie, before he quit his job altogether, going full-time at Conlin's instead. Then, on Christmas Eve 1984, a nature photographer was walking along the frozen Clark Fork River near the Bonner Dam when he saw something poking out of the frozen ground. As he approached to see what it was, he found himself looking at a decomposed human leg. Panicked, he memorized the terrain as best as he could and hurried back to his car, driving to a phone to call the sheriff's department. Larry Weatherman, who was now a captain, was among those who arrived at the crime scene, but the ground was so frozen that their shovels couldn't penetrate it to dig out the remains. Unable to make any progress, they sealed off the scene with a tent and left a propane heater running to try and warm up the grounds over the next 2 days, returning after Christmas. Finally able to excavate the remains, they quickly determined that the victim was a woman who had been shot in the head. Captain Weatherman couldn't help but think of Betty Beavertail, who hadn't yet been identified, whose body was found tangled in a chain-link fence not far from where they now were, about 4 years earlier. This second Jane Doe was given the name Debbie Deer Creek, after a creek that flowed nearby. Importantly, the medical examiner was able to recover her dental records, hoping they might help identify her, and he also determined that her hair had been dyed multiple times, most recently a reddish auburn colour. However, just like Captain Weatherman's previous murder case, the victim did not match the description of anyone reported missing from Missoula County. He submitted her details to various other law enforcement agencies around the country, and even had a reconstruction of her face made, something he had also done for Betty Beavertail. In both cases, he had found no leads. But Captain Weatherman had never forgotten about Wayne Nance. Though everyone else in his life now viewed him as a kind, considerate person, Weatherman was confident it was all an act. He had always believed Wayne had killed Donna Pounds all those years ago, and he knew Wayne was in the area again, and that both bodies had been found close to where he was living. He strongly suspected Wayne was involved in both unsolved murders, but he had no evidence to back up his gut, and no way to prove it. After seeing a story about Debbie Deer Creek on Crime Stoppers, Julie was convinced that the victim was Robin. The dyed hair, the age, the date she was believed to have been murdered, it all lined up. So she called the hotline, telling them what she knew. However, Robin was not the girl's real name, so did not help the investigation in any way. And Julie didn't mention she had been in a relationship with Wayne Nance, because while she thought Wayne had acted strangely around the time, no part of her believed he was in any way involved. After all, the Wayne she knew was warm and kind and charming. Just like Julie, Wayne's co-workers at Conlin's only ever saw this side of him, and nobody believed for a second he could be responsible for any sort of crime. So when women began filing complaints stating that Wayne had been making obscene anonymous phone calls to them after delivering furniture to their houses, they were ignored. Nobody at the store ever followed up on them, and they were dismissed as the work of a prankster. Later that year, in September 1985, the skeletal remains of another young woman were found by a bear hunter in a wooded area near Missoula, only 3 miles from where Debbie Deer Creek's body had been discovered. Found with no clothes, no ID, and no personal items of any kind, and believed to have been left there for around a year, she was dubbed Christy Crystal Creek, after another nearby creek. Her body was severely decomposed, and she had been shot twice in the head at close range, with 2 .32 caliber bullets discovered lodged in her skull. Christy was estimated to be between 18 and 35 years old, with her dental work indicating that she may have been of Asian heritage. Captain Weatherman was hopeful this might make it easier to identify her, given dental records had just helped him to identify Betty Beavertail at long last. Interestingly, it was actually the Green River Killer Task Force who helped them to identify her as Devonna Nelson, the 15-year-old runaway from Seattle, not Montana, as Weatherman had always believed. Given the task force was hunting a serial killer who had been preying on young women, mostly runaways and sex workers, since 1982, they were cross-referencing missing persons with unidentified remains across the region. Captain Weatherman had submitted dental records for Betty Beavertail to try and identify her, and the task force found them to match the records they had for Devonna, who they had initially believed may have been a victim of the Green River Killer. But while Captain Weatherman had been able to finally identify Devonna, he had no knowledge that Wayne had been in Seattle when she vanished, and her identity brought him and his team no closer to linking Wayne, or anyone else, to the 3 murders. A few months later, on December 12, 1985, the Shook family's quiet evening in their new home was interrupted by a violent knock on their door. At the time, Teresa Shook was baking cookies, and her husband Mike was relaxing on their new sofa, which had been purchased at Conlin's Furniture and delivered a couple of weeks earlier by Wayne. Before Mike and Teresa could properly react to the loud knock, their 4-year-old son Luke rushed to the door and opened it. Standing on the other side was Wayne, holding a gun and with a knife tucked into his belt. When Luke asked who he was, Wayne stared at him for a moment before responding, "I'm Conan the Barbarian." Then, without warning, he pushed the toddler aside and shut the door. He told Mike and Teresa that he wanted money, promising that they wouldn't be harmed if they complied with his demands. While it's unclear what happened next, something led Wayne to shoot Teresa in the leg, and it would later be determined he had attempted to dig the bullet out of her leg with a knife, though he had not been successful. It's unclear exactly why he did this, but it could imply he had intended for the shot to be a warning, just like in the Donna Pounds case, or that he had been trying to retrieve the evidence and cover his tracks. A struggle then broke out, during which Mike was struck in the head before being tied up, stabbed in the chest, and left to die where he fell. This was almost identical to what he would go on to do to Doug Wells, as detailed in the opening of this video. After killing Mike, Wayne forced Teresa upstairs and tied her to the bed with rope. He then assaulted her and stabbed her to death. She was left with her underwear missing and a pillow placed over her face. Throughout the ordeal, Luke hid in his room and remained too scared to move. His 7-year-old brother, Matt, slept through the entire thing, and their 2-year-old sister, Megan, was left crying in her crib next to her mother's lifeless body. Around 10 p.m, a neighbour observed a pickup truck leaving the Shook home, one that happened to match Wayne's vehicle, a maroon Toyota 4x4. And 2 hours later, Wayne returned and ransacked the home, stealing a stag-handled hunting knife, a collection of silver dollars, and an elk statue. But Wayne didn't realise that the statue was a one-of-a-kind item made specifically as a gift for Mike from Teresa, or that the knife was also custom-made, given to Mike as a gift from his father. Luke heard movement inside the house and crept out to see what was going on, quickly retreating to his room when he spotted the same man who had attacked his parents earlier that night. Wayne then piled up pieces of furniture and magazines and set them on fire, seemingly intent on destroying any evidence tying him to the attack and killing the children who might be able to recognize his face. However, Mike Shook had built his new home to be airtight, so when Wayne closed the door behind him, he unknowingly cut off the oxygen supply to the fire. Although it failed to properly ignite as he'd planned, it did fill the house with poisonous gases as it smouldered through the night. When Matt finally woke up, he made his way to his younger brother, intending to get their little sister and head to safety. But on their way, the two boys succumbed to the toxic fumes and passed out. The next morning, a family friend arrived to drop his son off, who Teresa had been babysitting. Seeing the smoke, he entered the house with his sleeve covering his mouth. After seeing Mike lying in a pool of blood, he located the 3 children who were all in critical condition. Megan's lungs had collapsed and Matt and Luke were both still unconscious. Getting them to safety, an ambulance arrived and rushed them to hospital where, miraculously, all 3 of them survived and made full recoveries, before going to live with one of their aunties. That Christmas, Wayne would go on to give his father, George, the elk statue he had taken from the Shook home as a gift. Sheriff Dye and the Ravalli County Police, however, hadn't even realised anything was stolen, with the house remaining sealed off as a crime scene for months. As with Wayne's other crimes, there was no physical evidence found at the scene linking him to the attack. Though Luke had seen the intruder and told the police it was someone the family had met before, he couldn't provide them with any specifics to help identify him. They questioned everyone who had worked on the construction of the Shook's home, but it didn't occur to them to speak to anyone who had delivered items, such as their furniture. So they never made the connection to Conlins or Wayne. Even Captain Weatherman had failed to connect the case, despite the use of identical rope binds to some of Wayne's previous attacks. The details of the rope weren't publicly released, and the specifics of Sheriff Dye's investigation weren't even shared with him, being kept contained to a small team of Ravalli County investigators. After 6 months, by July of 1986, the case seemed destined to turn cold. Around the same time, the family of the Shooks were finally allowed back into the house, and upon sorting through their belongings, Mike's father noticed all 3 of the missing items. Though at the time, he didn't bother telling the investigators, having completely lost faith in Sheriff Dye and his team, believing they had mishandled the case from the very start. Knowing they needed to try something different to lure the killer out, Sheriff Dye made the risky decision of releasing false information to the press. He told them that they had physical evidence from a suspect that was currently being tested. Seemingly, this news did actually have an impact on Wayne, because almost immediately after it was published, he began acting strangely. His co-workers at Conlins all saw the shift in his behaviour, especially his boss, Chris Wells. Everyone, including Chris, knew he had a crush on her, and he had made inappropriate advances towards her multiple times in the past. Chris knew he was a little eccentric despite his charm, and had previously been warned by her husband Doug not to encourage him, as he thought there was something off about him. And now more than ever, Chris agreed with him. Wayne was her best worker in the warehouse, but he was suddenly aggressive and temperamental. And with this shift, many of his previous quirks seemed to take on a darker undertone. Wayne had started snapping unwanted photographs of the various women at work, catching them off guard. Chris eventually had to step in and tell him he wasn't allowed to do it anymore. She had no idea that he had an entire photo album filled with pictures of her, many taken secretly as he stalked her, covered in scribbled messages about how much he loved her and how crazy he was about her. Growing paranoid that the police were closing in on him, Wayne had started spiraling. Numerous people in Missoula had strange encounters around this time with him, particularly when he was delivering furniture. On several occasions, he barely spoke to the customers, instead moving through their homes with an unsettling intensity, clearly memorizing every detail. He was searching desperately for his next target. Even Wayne's old friend, Bill Van Canagan, experienced a strange encounter with someone who, in hindsight, was almost certainly Wayne. One night, he woke to the sound of footsteps in his house, and when he went to investigate armed with a golf club, he saw a shadowy figure bolt out of the house. Whatever was going on inside Wayne's head, he clearly made the decision that Chris Wells, the object of his obsession, was going to be his next target. And so, on September 3rd, 1986, he attacked her husband Doug outside their house, setting into motion a series of events that would lead to his own downfall, as detailed in the opening of this video. Soon after the news broke, the man who had been parked in his truck outside the Wells home came forward, worried he was going to be linked to what had happened. It turned out he had nothing to do with Wayne or the attack, and he had been spying on his girlfriend across the street who he believed was cheating on him, before falling asleep. While Doug was severely injured during the attack, there was only one person who died that night. Captain Weatherman was shocked to learn that Wayne had been killed in a failed home invasion, especially given the crime mirrored almost perfectly what had previously happened to the Shook family. So after years of suspecting Wayne may have been the serial killer responsible for the many Jane Does he had been investigating, Captain Weatherman finally had the chance to look through his belongings, and what he found made it clear that his gut and his suspicions had been right all along. After searching his house and workplace, investigators found the stolen items from the Shook house, items only their killer could have had in his possession. They then learned that he had delivered furniture to their house a month before the murders, and that he had sketched a detailed map of their home. They also confirmed that the bullet found in Teresa's leg had been fired by a gun belonging to Wayne's father, George. There was no doubt that Wayne had murdered Mike and Teresa Shook. As well as the map of the Shook house, investigators discovered dozens of hand-drawn maps of other houses and apartments, most of which were confirmed to be homes Wayne had delivered furniture to for Conlins. They also discovered a hair that was found to have the exact same layers of dye on it as the hair of Debbie Deer Creek. They even found a photograph of him and a girl, who Wayne's acquaintances told them was the Robin he had dated, which was later confirmed by a forensic anthropologist to be Debbie, though they still did not manage to formally identify her. Given it seemed clear that Wayne had killed Donna Pounds, this meant they now had evidence tying him to 4 murders, as well as the attack on Chris and Doug. They then discovered that Wayne had been in Seattle when Devonna Nelson had vanished, making him the prime suspect in her murder as well. He was also assumed to be responsible for the murder of Christy Crystal Creek, given how close she was found to his other victims, and how similar her murder appeared to have been. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Wayne, he was never able to be charged for any of his crimes. And to this day, his involvement in several of the cases discussed, as well as several more in the area, is suspected but not definitively proven. In 2005, Robin, also known as Debbie Deer Creek, was finally identified as Marcella Sherry Bachman. Even though Weatherman had retired in the year 2000, he had never stopped searching for her identity, saying that it's one of the most important things law enforcement can do. Her brother Derek had spent years looking for her, going as far as to hire a private investigator. This PI then got in touch with the Green River Task Force, believing she may have been a victim of the Green River Killer. Just like they had done with Devonna, the task force made identifying Marcella possible, this time by obtaining DNA samples from her mother to compare to the many unknown victims they had. When Weatherman submitted a sample from Debbie Deer Creek in 2004 to the University of North Texas, who had been given a federal grant to assist in solving cold cases with DNA, it came back as a match for the sample Marcella's mother had provided to the Green River Task Force. Then, in May 2021, after 36 years, Christy Crystal Creek was also identified. With the use of new modern genetic genealogy techniques, relatives of hers were located, and she was finally revealed to be 23-year-old Janet Lee Lucas from Spokane, Washington. She had last been seen in Idaho in 1983, and nobody knows how or why she ended up in Missoula. Her identification provided closure to her son, who was 5 years old when she vanished, and had spent much of his adult life searching for her. Even now, No one really knows exactly how many lives Wayne took, or what else he might have done, and it's likely some of his secrets will stay hidden forever. For the people of Missoula, that uncertainty still feels raw, even decades later. Wayne Nance wasn't just a killer, he was someone they knew, someone they trusted. And in a place like Missoula, that might be the most frightening thing of all. And with that, our deep dive into the case of the Missoula Mauler comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. And if you found this video interesting, then don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts, and to appease the almighty algorithm gods, of course. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube, and a Patreon linked below. And I just want to take a moment to give a massive shout out to all of my existing members and Patreon supporters, as it really does mean the world to have you in my corner. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss. Christmas Day, 1971. In Anchorage, Alaska, brothers Gary and Dennis Lawler drive south on the Seward Highway, following the shoreline of Turnagain Arm, planning to photograph the beautiful wilderness. As the day progresses, they pull over at the McHugh Creek Recreation Area in the Chugach State Park, setting up at a vantage point on a small ledge to take photos of the waterfall and the surrounding creek. But as Dennis tries to steady his camera, something catches his eye. Hidden behind a bush just 10 feet in front of him is what looks like a mannequin, partially covered by snow, and I reckon we all know what that means at this point. As he leans forward to get a better view of it, he finds himself looking at the body of a young woman, nude from the waist down. Sergeant Walter Gilmore of the Alaska State Troopers and his team arrive at the scene to find a young blonde woman with her hands bound behind her back and her mouth gagged. The woman perfectly matches the description given for Celia Beth Van Zanten, an 18-year-old who had vanished 2 days earlier on her way to a local store, and it doesn't take long for them to confirm that it's her body in front of them. They soon determine that she had been assaulted and has a deep knife slash across her chest, and even more disturbingly, she was alive when she fell into the ravine. From what they can tell, she had attempted to climb out of the icy gorge, but with her hands tied she was unable to pull herself up and fell back into the freezing depths again and again, until the bitter Alaskan cold finally claimed her life. In the parking lot near the scene, Gilmore and the troopers identified tire tracks looping in wide circular patterns, suggesting that her abductor had likely been searching for her, waiting for her to reappear after she presumably escaped and fell into the ravine. While they're able to take some photos of the crime scene and discover a belt nearby, rain begins to fall, washing away any potential evidence that may have been left. Over the next 2 days, Sergeant Gilmore pursues every lead, investigating suspects within her circle of friends and family, as well as a lead hinting that she may have been hitchhiking the night she vanished, potentially picked up by her killer. But his breakthrough arrives when a respected state trooper calls him, claiming to have an informant who might be able to help solve the case, his own 18-year-old daughter, Sandra Patterson. Working the streets to support her heroin addiction, Sandra tells Sergeant Gilmore that on the night of December 19th, a man threatened her at gunpoint in the parking lot of the Nevada Club, saying he would kill her if she didn't obey him. She describes her attacker as a slender man in his mid-20s with horn-rimmed glasses. After binding her hands, he drove her south on the Seward Highway, eventually stopping at a motel in Cooper Landing, around 100 miles from Anchorage. Seeing how volatile he was, Sandra tried to remain passive and calm as he engaged her, hoping to stop him escalating into doing something even worse to her. He then drove her deep into the wilderness, where Sandra was able to convince him to let her go and not kill her. Though he'd told her he would hunt her down if she told anybody about what happened, after hearing about the discovery of Beth mere days later in the same area, she knew she had to come forward. As she talks to Sergeant Gilmore, she tells him, "He said he killed before, and everything he said was absolutely true. Everything he said he would do to me came true. Every threat he made, I believed. And if he says he's killed people, I believe he's killed people. And if you've got a young girl who's been killed around the same time and in the same area, then I believe it was him who killed her. I believe he'll kill me too." So the state troopers show Sandra a photo lineup of known predators in the area for her to try and identify her attacker. Without hesitation, she points to a man, Robert Hansen. Robert Hansen was a quiet, married father who ran a local bakery, but he was included in the lineup because just a month before he had been arrested on an assault with a deadly weapon charge involving a real estate secretary, Susan Heppard, for which he was awaiting trial. When questioned, Robert denies any involvement in Sandra's case, and with the only evidence against him being her statement, it's soon decided that she isn't a reliable witness due to her work as a prostitute and her history of addiction. As a result, Sandra's case is dropped completely, and with no other ties to the murder of Beth, Robert is released. By the time he goes to trial for his other case in March of 1972, he has successfully convinced the judge that he isn't dangerous, and that the incident he was arrested for was the result of a dissociative state brought on by his manic depression. He gets sentenced to up to 5 years in prison, but he's paroled in November of 1973 after serving less than 2 of them. It would take more than a decade for it to become clear just how big a mistake letting Robert back into the world was, and how close they had been to stopping a true monster back then. Because Robert Hansen would go on to become Alaska's most notorious serial killer, murdering at least 17 women until he was finally caught in 1983. Over the course of about 12 years, Robert carried out a chilling routine. He would lure women into his grasp, fly them in his private plane to a secluded cabin, and subject them to horrific assaults. Afterward, he would release his victims into the rugged wild, only to hunt them down like animals. This is the story of Robert Hansen, or as he's more famously known, the Butcher Baker. On September 12, 1982, 2 off-duty Anchorage police officers were hunting in the Nick River Valley, 25 miles outside of Anchorage, when they spotted something unusual while making their way up the river, a boot protruding from the sand. As police officers, they couldn't help but move in closer to investigate, and as they brushed aside the sand, they revealed a partially decomposed leg bone attached to the boot. Not wanting to disturb potential evidence, they noted the location and headed back to report their find to the station. When a team arrived at the scene, detectives carefully dug around the body, noticing that the face was completely wrapped in an ace bandage, almost as if the victim had been blindfolded. The team spent hours sifting carefully through the sand in search of any potential evidence, which eventually led to the discovery of a .223 caliber bullet casing, typically used in high-powered rifles. A preliminary autopsy of the victim revealed that the body belonged to a woman, and that she had likely been dead for around 6 months, with 3 .223 caliber gunshot wounds identified as her cause of death. Strangely, although the victim's body was found dressed, there were no bullet holes in her clothing, indicating she had likely been naked when she was shot, and somebody had redressed her after death. After 2 weeks, the body was formally identified as 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, a dancer at the Wild Cherry Bar in Anchorage, who had last been seen on November 17, 1981. According to her friends, she said she was meeting a man who had promised her $300 to pose for photos. Disturbingly, police had already noticed an unusual increase in missing person reports over the last 2 years, many of whom were sex workers or topless dancers, like Sherry. So having now discovered Sherry had been murdered, it made them question if there was something more going on here. The construction of the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline brought many transient workers to Anchorage, including prostitutes, con artists, and drug dealers. As many people came and left quickly, sudden disappearances had become common, so these sorts of missing person reports didn't initially raise any alarms. While police publicly denied Sherry's murder being part of a larger pattern of missing women, privately they began reviewing their case files. Sergeant Glenn Floth was tasked with figuring out if there was any connection to other recent cases that might imply Sherry's murder wasn't an isolated incident. First, Floth flagged a case from July 1980, in which construction workers digging near Eklutna Lake Road had discovered a woman's remains in a shallow grave. There had been little evidence at the scene, and the remains had been damaged and scattered by animals, making identification impossible. A facial reconstruction was done and circulated, but the victim was never identified and became known as Eklutna Annie. Later that same year, a second body was found nearby in a gravel pit. Identified as a topless dancer called Joanna Messina, her body was also too damaged and decomposed to gather much evidence. The body, wrapped in a sleeping bag, had been dragged to the pit and hastily buried, with a gunshot being determined to be the cause of death. But there was nothing for Floth to connect either of these bodies to the murder of Sherry, and as months passed, the case began to grow cold. But then on June 13, 1983, something happened that changed everything. That evening, Robert Yunt was driving his truck towards downtown Anchorage, passing by Merrill Field, one of the busiest small airports in the world, when he spotted a young woman running towards him. She was barefoot, handcuffed, and screaming in a panic. Stunned by the sight, he slowed his truck and spotted a man with a gun pursuing her, who quickly fled back towards the airfield. Frantic, the woman jumped into his truck, crying hysterically as she told him that the man he just saw was trying to kill her. So at her request, he dropped her off at a nearby motel she had been staying at, before going directly to the Anchorage Police Department to report the harrowing incident. Officer Greg Baker then arrived at the motel, where the young woman, Cindy Polson, began recounting her ordeal as he helped her remove her handcuffs. According to her statement, a man in his 40s with red hair had approached her on the street and offered her $200 for oral sex. But during the act, he locked a handcuff on her wrist and pressed a gun to her head, threatening to kill her unless she cooperated. Driving her to his home, he dragged her inside into his basement, which was filled with hunting trophies. Handcuffed and naked, he bound her to a pillar before subjecting her to hours of assault and abuse. Afterwards, he drove her to Merrill Field Airport, telling her he was going to fly her to his cabin in the Alaskan wilderness, boasting that he'd already taken many women there for fun, and that as long as she complied with his demands, he would release her there. At the airport, the man shoved her into a small plane, but as he unloaded supplies, she saw an opportunity to escape, managing to open the door and run for her life. Her attacker pursued her until she flagged the truck down, causing him to flee. Cindy was taken to Anchorage's Humana Hospital, where bruising and shackle marks around her neck and wrists were found to corroborate her claims of abduction and assault. She was then interviewed by the police, providing detailed descriptions of her captor's house, car, plane, and appearance. So investigators took Cindy to the Merrill Field Airport to try and identify the plane from her story. As it was such a small airport, it didn't take long for her to spot the plane, a blue and white Piper Super Cub. Checking with the flight tower, they discovered that the plane belonged to Robert Hansen. So Officer Baker and the investigators headed over to Robert's home in Muldoon, an affluent area near Anchorage. But Robert wasn't there. He finally arrived home around 7 a.m., where he was met by the officers. They asked him to come to the station to answer some questions, and he agreed without hesitation. When confronted with the accusations, Robert told them that his wife and 2 children were away in Europe, and provided an alibi claiming he had been with 2 friends, John Sumrall and John Henning, at the time of the alleged assault on Cindy. Both men confirmed his story when questioned. Afterward, Robert agreed to drive with the officers back to his house, where he allowed them to search his home and car. The officers found his home to match Cindy's description, but they didn't uncover any evidence linking him to the crime, though they did locate some ace bandages and a box of .223 caliber shell casings in his car. They then proceeded to search his plane at Merrill Field, but again, no incriminating evidence was found. The officers thanked him for his cooperation and informed him that he was free to leave. Some officers struggled to believe that Robert, a well-known local businessman who ran a successful bakery and was a beloved member of his church congregation, could be capable of such crimes. They even questioned if Cindy, a transient dancer and prostitute with a criminal record, might be fabricating the story to get money from him. But Officer Greg Baker remained convinced of her truthfulness. Delving into Robert's background, he discovered that he had prior arrests, including one in 1971 for kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon. Despite being convinced that Robert was guilty, he faced resistance from his superiors, and the case was dismissed and ignored. So Baker took matters into his own hands, gathering all the evidence he had collected and delivering the files to the Alaska State Troopers, hoping they would believe him and take action against Robert. Months later, on September 2, 1983, 2 hunters stumbled across a partially decomposed body along the Nick River buried in a shallow grave. Alaska State Troopers arrived on the scene, soon determining that the victim had again been shot with a .223 caliber bullet. The body was later identified via dental records as 30-year-old Paula Goulding, another topless dancer and sex worker from Anchorage, who had been missing for the last 5 months. Paula had been killed in the same manner as Sherry, and like Sherry, her body had been redressed after death. It seemed pretty clear to the investigators that Paula had been killed by the same person as Sherry, and that they were most likely dealing with a serial killer. As a result, a task force to investigate the cases was formed, headed up by Sergeant Floth. But because the department had previously struggled to handle another recent serial killer case, that of Thomas Richard Bundy, who took his own life before he could be apprehended, he chose to reach out to the FBI for assistance, wanting to make sure the investigation went as smoothly as possible this time. In response to the task force's request, Special Agent John Douglas was sent in to help, which is basically like hitting the FBI jackpot. Because if you don't know who John Douglas is, I've mentioned him a ton on the channel before, alongside another instrumental FBI profiler, Robert Ressler. Douglas was one of the first FBI criminal profilers and helped catch an insane amount of monsters. Nowadays, he's probably best known for his extensive interviews with serial killers, including the likes of Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, or maybe for the fictionalized version of him in the Netflix show Mindhunter. Developing a profile for their potential serial killer, Douglas theorized that he was likely an experienced hunter with low self-esteem and a history of rejection by women. He suggested that the killer might have some sort of physical appearance issues, or even a stutter, and that his abuse of women could be a way for him to seek revenge against them, taking his frustrations out on his victims, and that he likely targeted sex workers and topless dancers because they were often transient and less likely to be noticed. As he was beginning his search for this unknown serial killer, Sergeant Floth stumbled across a sealed manila envelope containing the memo from Officer Greg Baker about Cindy Paulson's account of being attacked by Robert Hansen. When he and Special Agent Douglas began looking into Robert's background, they couldn't help but see alarming similarities to the profile they'd just developed. Douglas observed that Robert was a hunter with a troubled childhood. He was a small man with a face marked by severe pockmarks, and he even had a speech impediment. The more they uncovered, the more they were convinced Hansen was their prime suspect. Having successfully hunted several large animals, Douglas suggested that it was possible Robert could have merged the love and thrill he had for hunting with his desire to harm women, leading him to quite literally hunt them. He also suggested that if Robert really was the killer, he would likely keep mementos from his victims to help him savor and relive his crimes. But before we delve into what happened next, to find out whether Douglas's profile of Robert as a potential serial killer was right, we need to take a look at who he was and what he had been doing up until this point. So you know what that means. It's time to go all the way back to the start. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa, to Danish immigrant parents. Growing up, he was caught between his father's stern religious ways and strict discipline and his mother's nurturing presence. When Robert was just 3 years old, the family moved west to Richmond, California, in search of better opportunities. However, the post-war boom proved overwhelming, and they eventually returned to the quieter life in Iowa, settling in Pocahontas, where they opened a bakery, which Robert was forced to work in from a young age. Though Robert was naturally left-handed, his father forced him to use his right hand. Along with this, Robert developed a severe stutter that would haunt him throughout his life. His teenage years were made even more difficult by severe acne. He was relentlessly teased by his classmates, and girls rejected his attempts to date them. By the time he reached his senior year, he was consumed with resentment towards the classmates who ridiculed him and the school that made him feel like an outcast. Despite his struggles with social rejection, Robert found comfort in solitude. He developed a deep love for the outdoors and became highly skilled at shooting. Whether with a bow or a gun, he enjoyed the independence of these activities. His passion for hunting grew, and he spent much of his free time in nature, away from the world and its harsh judgments. After graduating in 1957, Robert enlisted in the Army Reserves and completed his basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey. During this time, he had his first sexual experience, a disappointing encounter with a prostitute in New York City. After serving a year, Robert was discharged and returned to Pocahontas, where he worked in his father's bakery and also took a job as a drill instructor at a local police academy. But then, in what seemed like a turn of good luck, Robert got married. But even as things seemed to finally be on the right track for him, Robert still felt like an outsider and wanted revenge against those he felt had wronged him. This led to him setting fire to the Pocahontas County Board of Education bus barn. But he was caught and arrested, resulting in him being sentenced to 3 years in prison. His wife then divorced him, and his parents even shut down the bakery, moving to Minnesota to start fresh and escape the embarrassment of Robert's actions. However, after less than 2 years in prison, Robert was released on parole. This was in spite of being diagnosed with manic depression, as well as periodic schizophrenic episodes, and an infantile personality, which was said to make him obsessed with seeking revenge on those he believed had wronged him. After his release, Robert faced several more legal issues, including arrests for petty theft, and struggled with a series of low-paying bakery jobs. But then, after going to stay at his parents' lake resort in Leech Lake, Robert met Darla, a college student working at the resort. They spent hours together rowing on the lake and talking, and by the end of the season, they had fallen in love. Devoutly religious, after finishing her studies, Darla agreed to marry him, and the pair relocated to Anchorage, Alaska in 1967, where they would go on to have 2 children. There, far removed from the painful memories of his childhood, Robert was welcomed into the local community, well liked by his neighbours, and gained a reputation as an avid outdoorsman and hunter, pursuing big game such as Dall sheep, wolves and bears. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, Robert perfected his hunting skills, earning him a place in the Pope and Young Association's World Record Book, something Robert frequently boasted about. But it wasn't just his outdoor adventures that gave his life an air of success. Both he and Darla were thriving in their careers, Robert as a baker and longshoreman on the Anchorage docks, and Darla as a dedicated teacher working with children with special needs. From the outside, the Hansons seemed to be living the ideal Alaskan life. But despite this outward appearance, there was still something dark inside Robert that he was no longer able to keep hidden. In November of 1971, a young secretary named Susan Heppard was waiting at a red light on Northern Lights Boulevard. Lost in thought, she became aware of a man beside her in the adjacent car, staring at her. Without thinking, she offered a brief half-smile before looking away. When the light turned green, she continued on her way to her apartment in the quiet neighborhood of Spenard. Later that evening, as Susan was about to step into the shower, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Robert, who she described as an awkward-looking man wearing glasses and a bright orange hunting cap. He claimed to be looking for a friend who lived in the complex. After realizing he had the wrong address, he asked if he could use her phone, which Susan agreed to, probably taken aback. After a few minutes of nervously flipping through her phone book, Robert turned to Susan and asked if she'd want to go on a date with him, explaining he was new to the area. Susan quickly declined, telling him she was engaged. So after a few more uncomfortable moments of small talk, Robert left. About a week later, Susan left her apartment early in the morning to drop some friends off at work. But when she returned to her car, Robert suddenly appeared and pressed a gun to her head, ordering her to remain quiet and threatening to kill her if she didn't comply. Susan screamed in terror, but luckily her roommate had heard the disturbance, so she opened the door and shouted that she was calling the police. And as Susan collapsed to the ground in fear, Robert quickly fled from the scene. When police arrived, they found Robert walking in the snow nearby. Given he matched the description and a quick search revealed he had a gun on him, they took him in for questioning, where he claimed he felt dizzy and couldn't recall anything from that morning. Picked out from a lineup of suspects by Susan, Robert was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Released until his trial, it was at this point that the body of Celia Beth Van Zanten was found in McHugh Creek in the Chugach State Park, as detailed in the opening, which then led to Sandra Patterson coming forward and claiming that Robert had abducted and assaulted her too. However, the charges against Robert for attacking Sandra were ultimately dropped, and although he was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in prison for attacking Susan, he was paroled after serving less than 2 of them. His wife, Darla, stayed by his side throughout his prison term. When asked later why she didn't leave him after he was convicted for attacking another woman, she stated that her devout religious beliefs led her to think that he needed help and that she would be able to fix him. She was aware that he was up to no good, thinking that he was seeing prostitutes and paying for sex, but was completely oblivious to the horrific things Robert was truly doing when she wasn't around him. At that time, Anchorage had a notorious area known as the Tenderloin District. Dominated by Seattle Mafia boss Frank Colacurio, this district was a lawless zone centered around 4th Avenue, where anything could happen. Young women were drawn there by promises of large earnings from dancing at clubs with names like Wild Cherry, Arctic Fox, Booby Trap, and the Great Alaskan Bush Company. The oil boom brought a surge in population and disposable income, and the larger clubs were making substantial profits. Between these clubs, there were peep shows and even stands selling disturbing content, including illegal pornography. Violence was also rampant. Robberies, beatings, firebombings, and even murders kept the police busy. Amidst this chaos, Robert found his victims, women who were desperate for money, often agreeing to go with him for as little as $300. And despite his unassuming appearance as a typical family man, Robert's true nature would reveal itself once he was alone with the women. Most of his assaults were never reported, and even when Robert was identified, his outward respectability often overshadowed the accounts of the women involved. Alaska's vastness worked in his favor too, as there were rarely any witnesses to his crimes. Robert almost had a chance to be removed from society again in 1976, after he was caught stealing a chainsaw from a Fred Meyer store in Anchorage. Because of his previous convictions, he was sentenced to 5 years for the crime. However, after the Alaskan Supreme Court deemed the judgment too harsh, and with psychiatrists prescribing lithium to manage his bipolar disorder, Robert was once again released. In January 1981, Robert opened a bakery at the corner of 9th and Ingra, with $13,000 he received from an insurance payout following a staged burglary at his home. Not long after, he purchased a Piper Super Cub plane, although he never actually obtained a pilot's license. To almost everyone who knew him, Robert was seen as a successful local businessman who was actively involved in his local Lutheran church, where he made many prominent friends. But this was all just a front to enable him to live out his dark fantasies unchallenged. Douglas's profile of the potential Alaskan serial killer was frighteningly close to Robert. But if Robert really was their man, then how did he have an alibi for the abduction of Cindy? Douglas, confident that the investigators were right with their suspicions of Robert, suspected that his friends were covering for him and advised them to threaten them with charges if they were found to be lying. Acting on this advice, Sergeant Glenn Floth brought the men in for questioning, and almost instantly, they both admitted that they'd lied, thinking they were protecting Robert in a personal matter of some kind. But he still wasn't sure it was enough to secure a search warrant on him. Reviewing Robert's files, Floth stumbled across his insurance claim, stating his house had been burglarized with his hunting trophies having been stolen. Yet he'd been in Robert's house and he'd seen the trophies with his own eyes, so he began to consider the possibility of charging Robert with insurance fraud until he could secure more evidence against him. Thankfully, with the combination of Cindy Paulson's account, the fabricated alibis, the past convictions and accusations against him, his insurance fraud, and Douglas's profile of their serial killer, Floth was able to convince Judge Victor Carlson to grant a number of search warrants to be executed on Robert and his property. On October 27, 1983, Sergeant Floth and the team approached Robert at his bakery and escorted him to the police station for questioning. Robert went along with them without hesitation, not even asking why they wanted to speak with him. Floth had carefully prepared the interview room following advice from the FBI. Maps of the Nick River, photos of victims and crime scenes, and files containing information on Robert's family and acquaintances were scattered across the desk. Robert was left alone in the room to simmer, while Floth observed him through a two-way mirror. While Robert was being questioned, a team of officers searched his house, where his wife and children were left shocked and confused by the sudden intrusion. While they located a number of weapons, they didn't actually find anything that directly linked Robert to the murders. But just as they were about to wrap up the search and call it quits, an officer uncovered a hidden compartment in his trophy room. Opening it, they found a number of other weapons, including a .552 Remington rifle, a 7mm Thompson pistol, a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun, and most importantly, a .223 caliber Mini-14 rifle. Alongside the guns, there were newspaper clippings about the cases, ace bandages, various pieces of jewelry that would later be determined to belong to victims, and several ID cards belonging to missing women and known victims. The most crucial find was an aviation map of the Anchorage area, marked with 24 asterisks. 4 of the marks perfectly matched where the bodies of Sherry, Paula, Joanna, and Eklutna Annie had been found. There was now no doubt that Robert was the Alaskan serial killer, but even with just this evidence, it seemed like he potentially had many more victims than the investigators were even aware existed. At the police station, Robert denied any involvement in the murders, growing irate and angry as they pushed him to explain the mounting evidence against him. But Robert refused to cooperate, demanding he speak to his lawyer first, so the investigators formally arrested him, charging him with a wide range of offences including assault, kidnapping, weapons violations, theft, and insurance fraud, but not yet murder. As investigators awaited the results of ballistic tests, Robert pled not guilty on all charges in front of an Anchorage grand jury, with his bail being set at $500,000. Then, on November 20th, 1983, the results of the ballistic tests came back, and with the help of the FBI crime lab, the team confirmed that the shell casings found at the crime scenes matched Robert's rifle, with identical markings on the firing pin and extractor. With so much evidence against him, Robert realized that his chances of winning in court were slim to none. So on February 22nd, 1984, his attorney arranged a meeting to negotiate a plea deal. Meeting with District Attorney Victor Crum and Sergeant Floth, Robert confessed to the murders of Sherry Morrow, Joanna Messina, Paula Goulding, and Eklutna Annie, and agreed to reveal information about other victims. In exchange, he wanted to only be charged with the 4 currently known murders, to serve his sentence in federal prison instead of a maximum security prison, and for his name to be kept out of the press. Once the deal was finalized and Robert's fate was set, he no longer felt any need to hide what he'd done. After all, he couldn't receive any further punishment for it. So he began openly confessing to the twisted crimes he had committed. Robert told investigators that he would pick up women, normally offering to pay for sex with them before pulling a gun on them and forcing them to obey his commands. Then, he would typically take them to his plane and fly them out to his secluded cabin, where he would assault and abuse them. He claimed he would let them go home if they complied with all his demands, but if they didn't, he would strip them naked at gunpoint, blindfold them, and release them into the woods. Then, he'd tell them to run. Giving them a head start, he would then stalk them like prey, with either a hunting knife or a high-powered rifle, telling investigators that it was like going after a trophy Dall sheep or a grizzly bear. In some cases, he would let the victim think she had escaped, only to track her down and force her to run again. Eventually, when the victim was too exhausted to continue, he would stab or shoot her. And when asked why he redressed the bodies, Robert told them it was a way to assert control. comparing it to keeping a trophy. Investigators couldn't help but think of Richard Connell's story, The Most Dangerous Game, about a Russian nobleman who hunts down survivors from a shipwreck he had orchestrated for sport. While Robert claimed to have started killing in the early 1970s, he denied any involvement in the murder of Beth Van Zanten. Despite his denial and no concrete evidence linking him to her death, authorities believe he was likely responsible for her murder. Not only did her murder resemble many of his later crimes, but a mark on his map perfectly matched where she was discovered. So as a result, she is currently believed to be his first victim. At the end of the interview, having confessed to killing 17 women and assaulting more than 30 others, Robert was handed a large aerial map of the region. He then marked a number of locations where he claimed bodies could be found, including 12 grave sites investigators didn't know about. Because the areas were so vast and remote, rather than trying to follow his marks on the map, the team chose to fly Robert out to each location to help them identify where his victims had been left or buried. The following day, Robert boarded a military helicopter with a police escort to fly out to the sites on his map. At each site, now blanketed by snow, Robert led the investigators to the graves, where they marked nearby trees with orange paint to help them return and excavate. During the helicopter tour of the grave sites, Robert often became visibly excited, reliving the murders. Handcuffed and grinning, he would sometimes eagerly dig through snowdrifts to point out where he had buried the bodies. By the end of the day, Robert had shown them 12 sites where he claimed victims could be found. Due to heavy snow, however, most of these remains would not be recovered until the following summer. On February 18, 1984, Robert pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Paula, Joanna, Sherry, and Eklutna Annie. Though he was connected to 13 other deaths, he wasn't formally charged with any of them because of his plea deal. During proceedings, Assistant District Attorney Frank Rothschild stated, "Before you sits a monster. An extreme aberration of a human being. A man who walked among us for 17 years, serving us donuts, Danish, and coffee with a pleasant smile. His family was a prop he hid behind." A week later, Judge Ralph Moody sentenced him to 461 years in prison, plus life without the possibility of parole. He was then transferred to the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, and then back to Alaska, where he became one of the first prisoners at the newly opened Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward. By the end of 1984, investigators had managed to uncover 7 bodies from the grave sites Robert identified. Despite having confessed to 17 murders, and having a total of 24 markings on his own map found in his house, no other remains of his potential victims were located. After his conviction, the Pope and Young record keepers removed Robert's name from their record books. His wife Darla and their 2 children initially tried to stay in Alaska, but after enduring years of harassment, she filed for divorce and left the state for good. Over the years, occasionally hunters in the Alaskan wilderness would come across remains, prompting authorities to question Robert about whether the body was one of his victims. But despite his initial assistance in locating bodies, Robert never really cooperated with investigators again, making it hard to link him to anything else. In 2014, Robert was moved to the Anchorage Correctional Center for medical treatment, before dying from natural causes, and taking the secret of just how many victims he truly had to the grave with him. Some reports suggest the number could be as high as 37, with FBI experts considering him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Similarly, Sergeant Floth came away from his interrogations of Robert with the belief he had likely killed 4 or 5 women every year since the early 70s, which would mean he had many, many more victims than those currently known or suspected. It's also worth pointing out, when Robert kidnapped and assaulted Sandra Patterson back in 1971, just before Beth was killed, he told her he had already killed many other women. And I'm inclined to believe her account, making it questionable that Beth was truly his first victim, and opening up the possibility that Robert had been murdering women much, much earlier than is generally acknowledged. Robert's horrifying 12-year killing spree later became the basis for the 2013 film Frozen Ground, with John Cusack portraying Robert Hansen and Nicolas Cage playing an Alaskan state trooper investigating the murders. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Robert's name isn't as widely known as infamous figures like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. This could be because of the location of his killings in Alaska, often referred to as the last frontier, making his crimes feel somehow more distant and detached to the wider American public. For Robert, Alaska seemed like paradise. A big game hunter, he saw the vast wilderness as an ideal playground. But for his victims, the wilderness became a terrifying place where their screams could not be heard. And with that, our exploration of Alaska's most notorious serial killer, the butcher-baker Robert Hansen, comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please consider liking and subscribing, and feel free to comment down below to let me know your thoughts. and to appease those unpredictable and almighty algorithm gods. This was my first attempt at redoing the voiceover on one of my older videos with my real voice. I was initially planning to just record new audio and try and fit it to the existing video, but to be honest, as I was trying to edit it together, it became clear quite quickly that that wasn't going to be possible. So I ended up spending way longer putting this together than I'd expected, remaking the entire thing from the ground up. I definitely feel the video is now up to par with my current production, but I don't know if it's worth doing to more of my older cases. There's definitely a new audience showing up now I'm using my own voice on the channel, and I imagine a lot of them would really appreciate some of my older content, a lot of which I'm really proud of, being redone like this. It would be super easy to do it to my most recent stuff because of the way the videos themselves are now edited together. I'd basically just have to manually tweak scene lengths to fit my new narration. But a lot of you have just watched those cases, so I can't imagine you want to see me redo Albert Fish or the Happy Face Killer right away, right? So, yeah. I obviously want to keep researching and writing new cases for the channel, but as more people tune in to my new narration, I imagine there's going to be more and more people who want to hear some of the older cases, but only if it's me reading the scripts. I could definitely try and do one new case followed by one updated case for a bit, but like I said, I think it's a much more time-consuming pursuit than I'd maybe been anticipating before trying it out. Anyway, thanks again, and if you're new to the channel, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'll hopefully see you again soon. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.